Before we jump into this lesson, you need to brace yourself because this is a very long lesson, but it is filled with really, really important stuff that you need to know how to do, and it's very important that you actually watch through all of the content. To make it a little bit easier to take in, this lesson is kind of structured in 3 different sections, and the way that you can tell the difference between the 3 sections is the style frame that I'm working on. I'll be working on 3 separate style frames through the lesson. The first one will be finishing up the style frame that I had started in the previous lesson, but then we're going to go on to a second style frame for a different company. We're going to learn some more advanced things. You can kind of watch that in a second viewing if you need to, and then we're going to have a third style frame that I make where we go into even more advanced stuff. Again, all things that you need to know how to do inside of Photoshop. So with all of that being said, let's jump back in and finish up this Bartleman's style frame. Alright, I'm going to pick up right where I left off in the last lesson and take this style frame composition with all these different elements and try to bring them together so that they feel like they're part of the same composition in a single design. You know, the model feels very blue. I think just the color correction on the original stock photo doesn't really match the warmer background that I have for my style frame, and the jar, this 3D render of the product, doesn't really feel like it's part of the environment either. It's kind of just floating there on top of the background. So let's take a look at some things that we can do to make this all feel a little bit more uniform. First thing I think I want to do is color the photo so that it feels a little warmer and not quite so blue. And before I even do that, I need to just talk a little bit about ways to do things in Photoshop or Illustrator or any program really. There's pretty much a million ways to do anything, and I'm going to be teaching you the ways that I recommend to adjust things like color, but just because I'm teaching you one way doesn't mean that there's not another method, and if you asked 10 different designers how to do the same thing, you'd probably get 10 different answers. So just be aware that there are many different ways of doing any given task inside of Photoshop, and even the methods that I show you aren't the ones that I use all the time. Every project presents its own pros and cons for the way that you're tackling that project. But for the most part, this is the way that I typically work, and I find that it allows for the most flexibility. So what I'm going to be doing first is adjusting the color of this photo of the model. So with that layer selected, I'm going to come up to this tab right here. This is my Adjustments tab. And if you don't have that, just come up to Window and find Adjustments, and that'll bring up that panel. And adjustments are pretty self-explanatory. It's going to allow you to adjust whatever you're applying it to. It can be anything from the brightness of an image to the color to a lot of different other things. What we want to do right now is adjust the color. So these buttons are all going to generate what's called an adjustment layer, which we'll see how that works in just a second. But as I move my mouse around each one of these buttons, you can see that the name up here in the title changes. So the first one is brightness and contrast. Second is levels, which I'll explain that in a little bit. Curves, same thing. Exposure. So what I'm looking for is something to adjust the color, and this particular one right here is called Photo Filter, and that's what I'm going to use to warm up this image. So I'm going to click on that button, and that's going to automatically add a new layer, an adjustment layer, above the layer that I had selected. This is the adjustment layer icon, so you know that's the type of layer that you're working with, and you can see that by default it has a raster layer-based mask on it, and it's pure white. It's 100% white, so this means that it's going to be affecting everything below it, and that's how an adjustment layer works. It affects anything below it in the layer stack. So if I turn this off and back on, it's very subtle, but you can see that it's making the entire image just a little bit warmer. And if we look at our properties panel, it's giving us the controls of that adjustment layer. So right now, the way that this adjustment layer is working is through presets. Preset is just a bunch of settings that are preset so that you don't have to do much work to get them to actually start working the way that you want them to. So it's by default set to a warming filter. This is supposed to be like an actual physical filter that you would screw onto a lens in photography, kind of simulating that in Photoshop. So there are a whole bunch of different presets in here. If we wanted to cool it off, we could put on the cooling filter, and you see now everything is much bluer, a lot cooler. But you can also do custom colors. So if I click on this button right here, Then I've got this blue solid square right here. If I click on that, it brings up the color picker, and I can start adjusting this. So if I wanted to make it bright green, I could do that, click OK, and then I have a density slider. If I turn this down, it's going to be affecting everything a little bit less, and if I turn it way up, eventually it's going to make everything green, except for the layers that are above it, and that's why the actual 3D product render right here and the text are not being affected by it. But if I were to drag this layer up above, now it's affecting everything. Now, we also have this little checkbox right here that says Preserve Luminosity. If you remember, luminosity is the brightness of any given pixel. So this is just tinting everything to be green, or whatever color you have set here. If I uncheck Preserve Luminosity, then it's going to take the brightness of whatever color I choose here and also apply that to the pixels. So if I made it really dark, it's going to make the entire image dark. But if I preserve the luminosity, then it's just going to be affecting the color. The brightness of everything is going to stay the same. And that's why I like using the photo filter, because it makes it very easy to be able to just tint the colors without actually manipulating the brightness of anything. Okay, so that's how this photo filter adjustment layer is working, but obviously I don't want it to be this ugly green color. I want to make everything a little bit warmer. So I'll just pick a nice bright orange here and click OK. The problem is this is affecting everything, not just the model, and I want it to just affect that photo of the model. So I could drag this down above him, but it's still going to affect the background and not just him. So the way that I'm going to get this to stick to just him is by using what's called a clipping mask. And there's a couple different ways of enabling a clipping mask. The first one is just right-clicking on the layer and saying Create Clipping Mask. What that does is kind of indents the layer, and you see this little arrow that's pointing down to the layer below it. And if you noticed, now this is only adjusting that layer. So if I turn it off and on, you can see it's not affecting anything but the picture of this model. So that's what a clipping mask does. It takes whatever is contained in that layer, in this case it's an adjustment layer, and applies it only to what is directly below it. And you can have multiple clipping masks on the same layer. So I wouldn't want to do this, but let's say I want the Bartleman's jar to also be a clipping mask of this layer. I could right click on it and say Create Clipping Mask, and that's just going to stack it on top of the photo filter. And if I move this over, now you can see this image is only going to be contained in the actual photo of the man. It's using the alpha, or the transparency values of that layer, to contain the other layer within it. So that's how a clipping mask works. Another way to add a clipping mask, a much quicker way, is just holding Option or Alt, and then with your mouse between two layers, you see that little icon appear. I can click again and then move this layer over, and we can see that text is now contained all within just this one layer. So all three of these layers stacked on top of each other are clipping masks of this main layer. I'm going to undo, go into my history and just undo until I get rid of those clipping masks. I'm left with just the adjustment layer. And now I can make these adjustments just on him and see how it blends in with the rest of the composition. So I think I'm going to make it a little less red, bring it more towards yellow, somewhere around there, and then I think it's way too dense. I don't want him to look like he's a sepia tone, like old-timey antique photo. I just want to take that cool temperature of the original color correction and skew it a little bit warmer. So something like that actually I think is working much better. So just with that single adjustment layer, he already feels like he's kind of in the same environment as the background, at least. But I think he's a little bit too dark, so I want to brighten him up a little. I'm going to do that with an adjustment layer as well. So I'm going to come over to my tab, my adjustments tab one more time, and this time I'm going to go to this top middle one right here, which is called Curves. And this is a very powerful, very commonly used adjustment layer, and what it does is allows you to manipulate the brightness or darkness of any given range of values of pixels. I'm not going to get too technical with it, but I'll just kind of interactively show you how it's working. Now, this is not a clipping mask of this guy right here, right now. It's just a general adjustment layer, so it's going to affect everything under it. And I'm going to leave it like that for now. But what we're seeing inside this window right here is called a histogram. And what it's doing is basically telling me how much of this image is made up of dark pixels, how much of it is made up of bright pixels, and anything in between. So that's what this graph looking thing is kind of telling me. It's saying that there are a whole lot of pixels right here that are very dark. And on this side is my brights. So there are also a lot of pixels in my composition underneath this adjustment layer that are bright. And then we have some right in here that are kind of halfway in between values of brightness. Again, it's all just brightness values. It has nothing to do with color. And the way that I know and can remember that this is black, this is white, is this little grayscale slider down here. My darks are on the left, my brights are on the white. But then we have this line with 2 points on either end going from the bottom left to the top right. The way that this works is if I were to grab, say, the top right point and bring it down, it's going to darken the entire image. I'm basically grabbing the existing brightest point and just dimming it down. Or I could do the opposite and bring it to the left and make everything brighter. So this point on the top right corner is going to affect the brights, and then on the opposite corner we've got the darks. So I could bring the dark over to the right, keeping it at the bottom, and that's going to make everything much darker. Or I could bring it up, and that's kind of going to introduce a lot of gray into those blacks and make everything a lot more washed out. But that's not the end of curves, not by a long shot. What I can also do is grab anywhere on this line and then curve this line. And that's why this adjustment layer is called curves, because I'm able to grab any point in here and make a custom curve. And I could add more points too. So the further left I am, the darker the pixels are that I'll be adjusting. And the further right I am, the brighter the pixels I'll be adjusting. So if I wanted to, say, keep my mids right where they are, I'd put a point right about there. And then I'm not going to affect those at all. But then I could grab the darks and, say, make it a little bit darker, grab my whites, or my brights at least, the whites are all the way on the right, and make that a little bit brighter. And what this is called is an S-curve, or a contrast curve. And if I turn it off and back on, you can see that that's introduced a lot more contrast to my overall image. Now, that's not what I wanted to do with this particular curve, so let me just reset it by clicking on this button right here. Now, curves is very, very complex. I realize that that might be a little bit confusing, but trust me, this is something that you're going to want to learn and you'll probably be using very often. Adjustment layers also show up inside of After Effects, so it's definitely something that if you're going to become a motion designer, you're going to want to know how to use. Alright, so I want to brighten him up just a little bit. I'm just going to grab the middle of my line here and just brighten it up. I don't need to do too much, and I need to make sure that it's a clipping mask of this layer because I don't want it to affect everything else in my composition. So hold Option, click between those two layers, and there we go. Now it's just affecting him. Now I think that was a little bit too bright, so maybe right about there. And maybe the darks were a little too brightened up there. So I'm just going to grab right about here and pull it down just a touch. Alright, so let's turn off those two adjustment layers and turn them back on. You can see how that has kind of warmed up the image and brightened them a little bit more so that your eye is kind of going to him and focusing on him, especially his face right around here where it's brightest. So those two adjustments are working out pretty well. Now that we've got that going, I need to make sure that I stay organized in my layers palette. So what I want to do is just group everything that has to do with the model right now. So I'm going to hold down Shift and click on this layer so that all three of these layers become selected and then group them together. To do that, I'll just press Command or Control G, and that brings those three layers into a group. Now, a group inside of Photoshop is similar to a group inside of Illustrator, but as you can see, it's actually put it into a folder that I can twirl down or twirl back up. You can do the same thing in Illustrator, it just doesn't have that little folder icon. And groups inside of Photoshop give us a little bit more options and customizations that Illustrator doesn't. I'll rename this Model, and then I want to point out something neat about groups that are pretty powerful. If you remember, these adjustment layers will affect anything below them. So if I disable the clipping masks by holding Option and clicking to remove that clipping mask, even though it's within a group, it's still affecting everything. But if I come up to this little menu right here, these are blending modes, and we're going to get into them a little bit later, but you can see that it is set to pass through. If I click on any other layer, it's just set to normal. But a group, by default, is set to pass through. And what that's basically saying is, whatever the contents of that group are, treat it as if it was just ungrouped, as if it was just another layer within the layer stack. So that is allowing these adjustment layers to affect everything below it, even though it's in a group. But if I change that from pass-through to normal, then those adjustment layers are only going to affect what's in that group, and I don't have to worry about a clipping mask. So that's a really great way to be working with adjustment layers that you want to contain on a single layer or on a few layers and not other layers. Okay, next up, I want to work on the background a little bit because it feels pretty flat. If I turn this off and we take a look, it's just texture on a solid color. Remember, this background is just this flat color and we painted this texture over it. But I can kind of paint in some bright spots, some highlights, and maybe even some shading to give it a lot more depth. And I want to do this in a very targeted way to highlight the subject and the product and the text in my composition. I'm also going to be doing this using adjustment layers. So first of all, let me group my two background layers, select them both, and then press Command or Control G, and I'll rename this group BG for background. Inside of that group, I'm going to add an adjustment layer, again another curves. So I'll click on the top layer, then click on curves, and now I can start manipulating things. So I want to make this maybe a little bit brighter. And this is again affecting everything below it. But now that I have my adjustment set, I'm actually going to fill this mask with black so that nothing is being applied. So I'm going to swap my my foreground and background colors and then press Option Delete to fill with black. What that's going to allow me to do is paint in my adjustment layer to only affect certain parts of my image. And I'll just show you what I mean by that really quickly. If I take, say, just a rectangular selection and make a box and then fill it with white, Command Delete, because it is my background color, Command Delete is the background fill. And I'll deselect Command D. Now it's only affecting that square. If I hold Option and click on my mask, we can see again how that's working. Just the white is being affected. Everything that's black is not visible. Okay, I didn't actually want that square there, so I'm going to Option Delete one more time to fill with black my foreground color, so my mask or my adjustment layer isn't doing anything yet. Next, I want to take my gradient tool, which is right here, and this is going to behave differently than it does inside of Illustrator. Remember, in Illustrator, styling fills using gradients, but in Photoshop, we can basically generate gradients using pixels. So up here with this tool selected, we have some different options of what our gradient can look like. I'm going to go to the first one, and just to make this a little bit clearer, I'm going to make a new empty layer and take a look at the gradient preview up here, which is just going from black to white. So that's based on my foreground and background colors. If I swap these, then it's going from white to black. And I can adjust any of these colors and it will be updated up here. I want to leave it at black to white for now, but you can also go in and take a look at a bunch of different presets. And this is where we can really fine-tune what our gradient looks like. Now, in my particular case, I'm going to be using this on a mask, so color doesn't matter. It's just black and white values and everything between. So on my empty layer, with my gradient tool selected, and it's lined up with my foreground and background color, if I click and drag and then let go, it fills that layer with a gradient from the starting point to the ending point. So I can do this as many times as I want in whatever direction I want, and if I hold Shift while doing it, it will make it perfectly vertical or horizontal or a 45-degree angle. So I can control how that's looking based on where I click and where I let go. So that's the first type of gradient. It's called a linear gradient. The second one is a radial gradient. If I click on that and click and drag, then I can draw a gradient that's in a radial pattern. So it's giving me the center point is where I start clicking, and then where I let go is where the end of that gradient will be. This is the type of gradient that I'm going to want to use for my mask. We have some other options in here that are very interesting. They're very rarely used in my workflow, but you can play around with that to see what your different gradient options are. And like I said, there are tons of presets and an entire graph editor where you can just do crazy stuff, but that's not something I need right now. So I'm going to delete this layer and get back to my mask. and then make sure that my gradient is set back to the default of black to white, the foreground and background colors. And then I want to grab my radial gradient, and then I'm going to add a bright spot right around here, right behind the model's head. So if I click and drag, that's going to brighten everything up. But actually, this isn't working the way that I wanted it to. If I turn it off and back on, it's actually making everything outside of him brighter. If we take a look at the adjustment layer mask, we can see exactly why. It's because I painted from black to white, and the black pixels are the ones that are not going to be allowing the adjustment layer to work. So I actually need the opposite. So there are a couple different ways that I could do this. I could either swap my fill or my foreground and background and then redraw it, and there we go, it worked. Or I'll undo, and I could have simply just inverted this layer. To do that, I'm just going to go up to Image, Adjust, Invert, or Command I. That's a really easy way to remember it. Command I is invert. And that's going to basically invert the image. And so my black pixels become white, my white pixels become black, and now that is brightening up that spot behind him. So I've got my mask set up so that the adjustment layer is just making this very nice soft shape behind my model, and then I can adjust the curves layer even a little bit more. So I can make everything a little bit brighter if I wanted to, and that's looking really great. Now, the lighting of this particular photo looks like his left side is where the light is coming from this side of the frame. So I think instead of placing the bright spot right behind him, I want to move it even a little bit further over to the side. So I'm going to hold down spacebar to pan over here, start my gradient out here, and bring it all the way down to a little bit past his shoulder here. And now we've got kind of a light source over on this right side. Maybe I want to bring it in just a little bit more. There we go, and now that's much brighter, and that kind of looks like the same light source that's hitting him is also hitting this background that I've designed. Alright, so this is looking pretty good already just with the one adjustment layer, but I want to show you another method for doing a mask on any layer, but specifically for this adjustment layer that makes it really flexible. And I mean, I'm sure you noticed that I had to redraw this a couple times to get it looking exactly the way that I wanted it to. And I think there's actually a little bit more efficient way to do this, and that's through actual vector paths. So I'm going to come over to my shape tools right here and hold down on that and then find the ellipse tool. Then I'm going to come up here and make sure that this is not set to shape. I don't want to actually draw a shape that has a fill or a stroke on it. I want to just draw an empty path. So I'm going to select path, and then I'm going to draw an oval shape right about here and let go. Now because this is vector, it's going to be very easy to adjust. If I press A, it gets to my selection tool, I can move it around. But now that I have that selected, I need to apply it as a mask to this adjustment layer. Just like I drew a vector mask path to mask out the photo, I'm going to apply this circle to this adjustment layer as a mask. So to do that, I'm just going to press the Add Mask button one more time, and now I have two separate masks on the layer. I no longer need the layer mask, so I'm going to right click on it and say Delete Layer Mask, and I'm left with just that vector mask. Alright, I pressed Enter on the keyboard to hide the mask, and I'm left with this bright spot that's a perfect circle behind my model. And obviously that's not what I want. So how can I get this to work the way that I need to? Well, that's where the Properties panel is going to come into play. By default, if you click on a layer mask, it's going to bring up the mask properties up in the Properties panel. If you're not seeing these properties, then you can just cycle through these buttons right here. The first one is the adjustment layer controls for the curves. The second one is the actual shapes controls. Because that was a circle, I can control things like the width and the height. And I can also control whether this is an add or a subtract type of path to control what part of the adjustment layer is actually being visible. But what I'm concerned with is this last one right here, masks. And this is where I can control the feather of the mask. Or another way to think of this is kind of the blur. So if I bring this up, you can see that it's really softening it out. But what's great about it is that it's a vector mask still, so I'm able to adjust it very easily, reposition it, resize it, even make it more of an oval shape, rotate it maybe. And once I'm happy with that, I'll press enter, and this is going to say that it's going to turn my live shape into a regular path. Do I want to continue? Yes. I don't really need this to be a live shape with the special custom controls, being able to control the size of the shape anymore. I just want to be manipulating a path. And because it's vector and we have these nice mask properties, it's very flexible. So I can at any point not have it feather out so much and be a much more visible bright spot on the background. In this case, I want it to be nice and bright. But I think I need to make the mask much bigger. So I'm just going to switch to my direct selection tool. Shift A will allow you to cycle between multiple tools using the same shortcut. So I pressed A to go to my selection tool and then Shift A to switch to my direct selection. But now I can drag a box around this point and manipulate these handles just like any other vector path. So I basically just want to bring this way out so that I'm not getting any darkness over here. The brightness is as bright as it gets in that top corner. And then maybe bring this down a little bit, and I think I want to feather it out even more. So it's going to be around 200 pixels probably that I want that feathered out. And now I can really customize how that is affecting my overall image. And like I said before, it's going to make it look like a light source is actually affecting part of my composition, just like it was the photo of this model. Alright, so that's how we can use vector masks on adjustment layers to brighten some stuff up, and that looks great on that side of the image, but now I need to do something with the left side because it still doesn't look that great with those two elements, the text and the jar, just on top of the background. And I think what I want to do is just make a very similar type of adjustment, but on the side with the text and the jar. So I could make another path, but I might want to adjust the curve to have a specific brightness for that section, so I'm just going to duplicate the layer. To do that, I'm just going to drag it down to the new layer button, and that will make a duplicate. Alright, so obviously that's overlapping. I'm going to grab this path, select that path by clicking on it, and then Shift A to switch to my regular selection tool, the path selection tool, and bring it over here. Now I want to scale it down quite a bit. So instead of actually just grabbing each point and bringing it in, I'm going to press Command or Control T to do my transformation. And then I can grab these handles, hold down Shift and Option to scale from the center, and just bring that down right around that section. Alright, so I might need to manipulate those paths a little bit. I pressed Enter, by the way, to apply that transformation. And I definitely need to adjust the feathering because you can see that that's barely doing anything at this point. So let's go in our mask options and then turn the feather down just a little bit. Alright, there we go. That actually isn't bad. That's going to give just a nice little pop, a shine of light behind the text, and I think I'm happy with that. Now, what I don't like is how the jar kind of just looks like it's floating there. I want to make it look more like it's sitting on a surface or casting a shadow onto the background at least. So I'm going to need another adjustment layer, but instead of brightening it, I need to darken the background. So I'm going to go to my Adjustments tab, adding new curves. And this time I think I am going to use just a layer mask instead of a vector mask because I want it to have some texture. This is kind of a stylistic choice that I'm making just based on the texture that we added to the text and the background. I want it to be kind of grungy and just a little bit more organic. But let me zoom in nice and close here and just show you really quickly that this feathering that we have options for on the vector masks also applies to raster masks. So if I were to just switch to my elliptical marquee tool and draw a circle right around here, reposition it by holding down spacebar, I could, fill this in with let's start with black because that's actually the opposite of what I need. But then I'll just invert it. So it's only going to affect that part right here. Which, by the way, I just did another little tip. This is something that's going to happen a lot. I'm going to do something and realize that this is something you should know. It's a quick little tip that just happens in my workflow. It's things that I use all the time, every day within Photoshop, and sometimes they just come up and I'm going to use them without thinking of it, but I'm going to try my best to point them out as I do it. What I did was made a selection based on that layer. So if we take a look at the layer, you see that it's just a circle, and I held Option and clicked on the layer mask to view that mask. But when you hold down Command or Control and hover over a thumbnail or a layer, you can see that you get the little marquee box over your hand. And if I click, that's going to make a selection around whatever the contents of that layer are. So if I were to do that to the text, click on that, it makes a selection of the text. And if I did that on the mask for the text, it's going to make a selection around that texture that I had drawn right here. So that's making a selection of any layer just by holding down Command or Control and clicking on that layer. Alright, so now that that's there, I can increase the, or decrease the curves to make it a little bit darker, and then feather it out. And this is what I wanted to show you, that you can do feathering on both vector and raster masks. So there we go. Maybe scale that down a little bit, Command T to transform, and then just reposition it a little, and then maybe make it a little bit darker. And there's a little bit of a shadow. I think I'll widen it out a bit. But like I said, I don't actually want to use a solid shape like this, even though it is a little bit feathered. I'd like to introduce some texture so that it feels a little bit more organic, a little more hand-done, to match the rest of the style from this design. So I'm going to clear out this layer mask just by filling it with black, Command Delete to fill with your background color, and I'm going to bring out my Wacom so I can paint this in by hand. So here we go. I've got my Wacom in front of me. I'm going to use my stylus and brush on some white to darken this up. And I want to make sure that my feather is turned all the way back down to 0 so it doesn't feather anything out. And then I need to pick a brush. So I'm going to go into the dry media brushes inside Kyle Webster's, or actually not dry media brushes. I want to go into the Mega Pack from Kyle Webster and then take a look at what we have. I'm thinking I want to use something in probably the drawing box. And then, I don't know, this one, Charcoal Burn Big, that looks pretty grungy. Let's just take a look at what that looks like as I brush it on. Yeah, I think that's got some good texture. That can probably do what I want. So I'm going to undo Command Z, and then remember, if I just press Command Z over and over, it just steps back and forth between the last thing that I did. So I need to hold down Command Option Z until and keep pressing Z until I've gotten back to where I need to be. Alright, so what I want to do is just start brushing in very lightly. And I'm just going over this over and over again with my stylus, bringing out some texture into the foreground. And I think I'm going to be going over this both positively and negatively. So I'm going to be painting some stuff in and then maybe taking some out as well. And I'm just kind of estimating where I think the shadow would be. Alright, so there's my basic general shape, and I think I want to make my curves adjustment not quite so extreme. I don't want this to be totally, like overpoweringly noticeable, but just something to give a little bit of depth. Okay, and then I'm going to switch back to my brush tool, B on the keyboard, and the keyboard shortcut to swap your fill and stroke is X. So you can see that switches, sorry, I keep saying fill and stroke because of Illustrator, it's foreground and background color. But that swaps your foreground and background, and it's a very easy way to be able to switch between those, especially when you're working with something like a mask. So I want to paint black now, so I swapped those, and I'm just going to start etching out a little bit at a time so that we don't see quite as much as I initially painted in there. So maybe over here is a little too much. Swap my fill and stroke again so I can brush some more back in, and it's just kind of a back and forth push and pull until I have something that I'm happy with. Oops, let's take some of that out. And I'm thinking that might be pretty good. And then I can, play around with this a little bit, maybe bring the whole thing up a little bit. I'll press V to grab my move tool and just move the mask up. This is my smart guides are on. That's why we're seeing all these magenta lines. Another quick tip that's very helpful is if you hold down Control while moving something or doing anything that's snapping, it will temporarily disable that snapping. So I can very precisely move this up to where I want it, and it looks like I want to move it a little bit to the left. But there you go. If you hold down Control while you're moving something around or trying to line something up, draw a selection, anything where snapping is being introduced, Control will temporarily disable that as long as you're holding it down. So there we go. We've got something that's a shadow. I think that's still a little bit too intense, so I'm going to bring that up just a little bit and take a look at that off and on. There we go. So that just kind of anchors it into the background just a tiny bit. Maybe just bring it down a tiny little bit more. There we go. Okay, I think that's subtle enough that it's not just in your face, but you can definitely tell that it's there. And maybe make this a little bit darker on this side. You can see a little bit more. Oh, I'm painting black. I need to paint white to add to my mask. And I think that looks good. There we go. Okay, great. I'm going to make sure that I save, Command S, save all the time so you don't lose your progress, and then I'm going to move on to the text. I want to do a similar kind of textured adjustment layer here, but highlighting that text instead of giving it a shadow. So I'm going to duplicate this layer one more time. Another way to duplicate a layer, like I said, there's 10 ways to do anything in Photoshop, is with that layer selected, press Command J, and that duplicates it. Alright, now I can clear out this mask, Command Delete to fill it with the background color, and this is going to be up here this time. So I'm going to switch back to my brush tool and start brushing in white. Maybe make my brush a little bit bigger. That's the right and left bracket keys will increase or decrease your brush size. You can also just come up to here and adjust the size just by sliding this around. But keyboard shortcuts, they just speed up your workflow, so get used to using them. You're going to want to use them all the time. So I'm going to brush this in, and this is brushing dark. That's not what I want. I want to make this bright, a little bit of a highlight on this text. So I'm going to brighten that up a little, and then just start brushing it in. Now I think the flow of my brush is a little too intense. It's applying too much texture too quickly. So I'm going to come up to my flow, turn it down, and then take a look at what that does. See, now with a single brush stroke you see a lot more texture coming through. I'll turn it down even further, and I think that's a much better flow for what I'm trying to accomplish. So I'm going to fill with black one more time to clear that layer out, and maybe make my brush a little smaller, and then start painting out some texture to give this kind of almost like a little light burst that just feels a little bit more organic than if I were to use a solid vector or even a feathered vector mask. This way I can just bring in some texture, and again I'll probably add a bunch and then take away some just to give it as much of an organic feel as possible. So something like that. I'll swap my foreground and background and start painting out some of these parts that go a little too far, and just so it's easier to see I'm going to turn this up really bright. And now I can really grunge up the edges here. Whoops, that was a little too much pressure, but that is one of the benefits of the Wacom Stylus tablet combination, is that the harder I push, the more texture or the more intense that brush is being applied. So I'm just kind of doing really light brush strokes very quickly to add in some texture here. Maybe that was a little too much, but just something to give it a little bit of an organic vibe. And then I'm going to fill in the inside with white so that that's really bright behind the text there. And maybe just take a little bit of it out. That was a bit too much. Okay, now let's adjust our adjustment curves layer down a little bit. Maybe add in a little bit more right here, making sure that I'm filling with white and not black. But now that just has kind of a grungy, textured look behind it, giving some highlight to that line of text. I think that's working out well. And now that I see it, I think maybe I want to do the same kind of thing to the jar. So I'm going to paint in some white on the same adjustment layer, because I want it to be the same brightness adjustment, just around the jar itself. And that way these two items can kind of feel a little bit more coherent, like they're part of the same thing. I don't really want to do that down here where I've got the shadow, so maybe I'll fade this out a bit so it doesn't come down quite so far. Just painting a little bit of that out. Backing it off a little bit. And then maybe thin this out a little too. The gap between the text and the jar doesn't need to be quite so bright. These adjustments are obviously being done very subtly. I'm doing it a little bit at a time, so it might be a little hard to see what's happening as I'm doing it. But at the end of this, I'll be able to turn the layer off and back on, and we can really see what's going on. I think my adjustment layer is a little bit too intense. I need to bring that curve down a little bit. Again, I don't want to overdo it and make it look really just overkill bright, but just something that brightens it up a little bit. Even that might be a little too much. Something like that really makes that pop just a little tiny bit, and that can help draw your eye to what you want the viewer to be looking at. Alright, so we've got our highlights on those text and jar layers. We've got the shadow underneath the jar. If I turn those off and back on, you can see just how much that pops, even though it is a pretty subtle adjustment. And then we've got our bright spot behind everything. If I turn all of those off and back on, that really makes a big difference. And then we've got our bright spot on the right side of the frame. So we're making some pretty good progress here. I think I'm done with my Wacom for now, so I'm going to put that away. And what I want to do now is kind of in the same way that I warmed up the photo of the model, I want to do some color adjustments and maybe some brightness adjustments to the actual product so that it fits into the design a little bit better as well. I don't want to manipulate this too much because this is the product render that the client gave me to work with. But I think I can still make it fit into the scene a little bit better. So let me clean up my layers a little bit, close up the background, close up the model, and take a look at the jar on its own. And I did this using an adjustment layer with the model, but like I told you, there's 10 different ways to do any given thing inside of Photoshop, so I'm going to take this as an opportunity to show you another way of doing this. So instead of using an adjustment layer, I'm going to come up to Image and then Adjustments. And this menu looks very similar to the Adjustments panel that we have right over here. We have Brightness, Contrast, Levels, Curves, Exposure. If we come up to Image Adjustments, then we can see brightness, contrast, levels, curves, exposure. They're all set up exactly the same way, and they even do the exact same thing, but they're applied differently. Now, because this is a smart object and not just a standard layer, it's going to apply an adjustment to that layer in a way that's non-destructive, in a way that allows you to manipulate it, turn it on and off, and even do some more advanced things with it if you want to. If this was not a smart object, in fact, let me just show you. If I right-click on this and say Rasterize Layer, I've lost my smart object. I can no longer scale this up without losing quality. I'll undo. If I come up to Image Adjust Curves, I'm going to get a pop-out menu that looks exactly the same as my curves adjustment layer, but I could brighten this up. I could maybe not bring it quite that far up, but maybe darken the darks a little bit and say I like that adjustment and click OK. But guess what? That was a destructive edit. There's nothing I can do to bring that original back except undo. So you can see the layer hasn't changed at all, and that's just the way it is. But if I back up to where it's still a smart object and go up to Image Adjustment Curves, then I make my adjustment on the brights a little bit, maybe keep the darks just a little bit darker, and then click OK. Then that curves adjustment is now showing up as a smart effect or a smart filter, and that's just another great reason to use smart objects. I use them on basically anything that I need to be able to apply filters or effects to, adjustments, so that I can manipulate them after the fact. A little secret that I'll let you in on is once you get into After Effects, effects like this and filters that you apply to layers are always editable. You can always go in and edit them at any point and make adjustments however you want. In Photoshop, it's not the case unless you're working with smart objects or adjustment layers. So that's why you need to work with smart objects and adjustment layers. And let's say I don't like how bright that is. I think I might have overdone it a little bit. All I have to do is double click on that curves, and I can just continue editing this however I want to. So I'll bring that down so it's not quite so bright. Click OK, and now I can see how that just barely brought up the brights. And actually, I think that's not quite enough. So I'm actually, what's bothering me is that this is so gray. I want it to be more white. So I want it to be right around there, but that's affecting the yellow a lot. So I think I just need to adjust my curve a little bit, maybe add another point in here. This one is going to maybe affect the yellows, the midtones a little bit, and that way I can just brighten up that white part. Click OK, turn that off and back on, and see how that's affecting my jar. And I think that's actually what I wanted it to do. Now let's take a look at this little thing right here, Smart Filters, and this white icon, this thumbnail. If you'll notice, it looks pretty much the same as a layer mask up here because that's exactly what it is. It's a mask, but for the effects that you're applying to that layer. So if I wanted to, say, only apply this to the white part of the top, the lid of the jar, then I could make a selection, and this time I'm going to do it using the lasso tool. We haven't really touched on this yet, but this is just another way to kind of freehand draw a selection. So if I click on that lasso, I can click and drag and just draw around here. I can hold down Shift and add to my selection. I can hold down Option and remove from my selection. And that's actually what I'm going to do. I'm going to remove everything but the lid of the jar right here, being very careful. This is not a very accurate way to make selections, but there you go. We have it working. And then I need to fill that with white. Actually, that's what I want to remain white. I need everything else to be black. So just like inverting a layer, I now want to invert my selection so that everything but this is selected. To do that, you come up to Select and then Inverse, which is Command-Shift-I. That now inverts my selection, and I can fill that with black. And now my adjustment is only affecting that part of my selection, this part of the mask. So I can go into that curves and do something wild with it, and it's going to only affect that lid. I'm not using this mask very often because 99% of the time I'm wanting to affect the entire layer and not just a specific part of it, but it is very useful to know about and something that's worth knowing about. So let me undo until I don't have that anymore and deselect by pressing Command D. That gets rid of my entire selection. And now I've brightened that jar up a little bit. But it still feels a little bit like it's just slapped there on the background, and I want to make it blend into the scene a little bit more. To do this, we're going to apply what's called a layer style. Now this is something that could have an entire lesson on its own. It's so advanced, there are so many options, but we're going to use a decent number of them on some of these style frames. To get into your layer styles for any given layer, you need to double click on the layer, but you have to do it in kind of a very specific area. If I were to click on the thumbnail, double click on the thumbnail, it's going to open the smart object. And if I were to double click on the text, it's going to let me edit the text. Instead, I need to come right over here in the blank space and double click there. And that's going to bring up your layer styles menu. Now this is a very deep, complex menu with lots and lots of different settings and lots of confusing things. Like I've told you in the past, Photoshop is such an old program and they keep adding features to it that things just get buried and put in places that you'll never find them, and I am discovering new things all the time in Photoshop that have probably existed forever. They're just hidden away in obscure places and named things that don't make a lot of sense. It's just part of working in Photoshop. You have to constantly be learning, discovering new things, and teaching yourself. But what I want to do right now is apply what's called kind of a light wrap, and what it's going to do is make the edges of this layer feel like it's being lit a little bit by the same lighting in the environment. That's what a light wrap is. And to do that, I need to add an inner glow. So I'm going to click on that text, inner glow, and you see that automatically adds the checkbox so that is enabling the inner glow. And then I want to zoom in here nice and close. Now, I can't really switch to any other tool here, but while I'm in my layer styles, I can still zoom in by pressing Command plus to move that around, and then click and drag using my hand tool to get a nice clean view of what's going on here. So if I turn that off and back on and you take a look at the edge of my layer, you can see that that's kind of brightening it up. Now what's happening is it's adding what it sounds like an inner glow to the alpha channel of that layer, and it gives me a lot of controls on how that glow is being applied. Right now it's just this white gradient, so it's actually going from white to transparent white. But if I were to just change this to a solid color, then I could click on this color and say make it, I don't know, blue. I'll make it this super bright blue, and then take a look at this opacity right here, this slider for opacity. I could bring that up, and we're not really seeing it. It is tinting it blue a little bit. If I turn it off and back on, you can see. But the reason why it's not just adding this blue ring around the entire jar is because of this blend mode up here. And you see it's set to screen. Blend modes is something that we're also going to be digging into in just a little bit, but a blend mode is a way to blend pixels with other pixels. So if I turn this from screen to normal, then we're really going to see that blue. And we can come down to some other settings like the size here. If I turn the size up, you can see that brings the glow in a whole lot more. The choke is going to kind of add contrast, so it's not quite so feathered. And another thing I want to point out is this little preview box over here. This is kind of giving you a preview of what it would look like if it were on a square. Now, obviously, this is not at all what I want. I don't want it to be just this solid blue color. I want it to be more of an orangey color. So I'm going to drag it to right around here, and then click OK. And then I actually do want to use that blend mode, because this is just literally painting kind of like a gradient around the outside edge into my layer, and it's not looking good at all. Even if I were to turn the opacity down, it doesn't look that great. But if I change the blend mode to screen, you can see that that's preserving a lot more of those highlights and just kind of tinting everything around it a little bit more to be warmer. And that's what I want. I want this to be a very subtle effect. And like I said, it's called, often referred to as a light wrap, but that's just going to allow me to bring in a little bit of warmth around the edges and kind of have it feel like it's a blending in to the background and the scene a little bit more. So I think I'm going to increase my opacity a little bit, maybe make this a little bit more orange, and maybe a tiny bit darker, somewhere right in there, and then turn that preview off and back on. So there we go. We just brightened up the edges a little bit, and now it feels a little bit more like it's part of the scene. Alright, so that in combination with the brightness that we put behind it, painting that in by hand and the shadow underneath it, that jar now feels a lot more solidified into this scene. I think I want to do the same kind of thing to this image, where I add a little bit of a light wrap to him, because these edges are just very still, they look very cut and pasted onto the background. So maybe the same technique can work well for the photo of the model. I can actually copy a layer style by right-clicking on the layer and saying copy layer style, and then I'll go into the model, onto that layer, and right-click and say paste layer style right here. And there we go. It's added that same inner glow to that layer. Obviously, this is way too extreme. It's very glowy now. I don't want it to be quite so dramatic. So I'm going to double-click on the inner glow so I can adjust this and bring the size way down. That's way too much, and it's way too opaque. I want to bring the opacity down so that's nowhere near affecting as much of the image. But let me zoom in nice and close here, and then reposition. So this is the preview turn. Well, actually, I need to turn the inner glow off and back on. You can see what that's doing now. I think that's still a little intense, so I'm going to turn the opacity down and maybe increase the size just a little bit. That opacity, though, still needs to be brought down. I don't want this to be overly dramatic, just something that blends in the edges of that image to the overall the scene a little bit better. And I think that tiny little adjustment, even though it's subtle, really does add quite a bit, especially if you take a look like right in here. If I turn that off and back on, you can see that it's adding this nice glow on these darker spots that are kind of looking like almost like a reflection or a bounce of the light from the background. So that really composites everything together a little bit better and makes it look much more cohesive. Alright, I'm going to save, and then I think I can make my background just a little bit more dynamic if maybe I add another gradient adjustment layer. So let me close up this group, and I can collapse all of these effects and curves. They are adding a lot to this layer just by collapsing this little arrow right here. And that way my jar has everything contained in that one layer, still taking up the same amount of space. And then I'll go into my background group, and I want to add another curves adjustment. So I'll go into my adjustments, click on curves, and I'm going to probably want to bring this one darker, just a little bit darker. And what I want to do is darken the bottom part of the image so that the top, probably 80% of the background, is brighter than it is on the bottom. And I'll do this through a gradient. So switch to my gradient tool, and I want to do this with a linear gradient. And then I'll just click, hold shift, and drag. And that, you can see, just darkens the background at the lowest level a little bit. I think I'll just drag that again and see if I can bring that down a little bit. And just that little bit just adds a little dimension to the background. And then finally, I think that I just want to brighten up the center of the frame a little bit, because this highlight that we have right here is interacting with the background pretty well over here, but it's much more noticeable over here. So I think I want to just take maybe this adjustment layer right here and duplicate it, so Command J, and then manipulate that mask path. You can see that I'm using different methods all the time. Sometimes I'm just using the gradient tool and dragging, and I'm happy with it. Other times I want more flexibility, and I'll use a mask path. But basically, I just want to brighten up this area a little. Maybe it doesn't have to be quite as much as the other layer, but now we can see what that looks like with it off and on. And I think that's actually working out really, really well. Alright, so we've taken this pretty far, and just to give you an idea of how dramatically different this is, I want to turn everything off that we've enabled. And a really quick way to be able to do that is using this search feature right here. So there's lots of different options of being able to show only the layers you want to based on the kind of layer it is, the name, the effect, all different kinds of things. So if I leave it on kind, I can take a look at the different types right here. So we've got an image, like a pixel based layer, we've got an adjustment layer, text layer. I want to see all of my adjustment layers. So I'm going to click on that, and it's only going to show me those adjustment layers. Now I can click, drag up all the way to the top and let go, and it's disabled all of my adjustment layers. So just look at how dramatically different that looks with just my adjustment layers being turned off and back on. So that's that. Now let's say I want to look at the effects and then go to the inner glows. Everything that has an inner glow on it, so I'm going to turn that off, and I'm going to turn that off, and I'll turn off the curves as well. Now I'm pretty sure if I switch that off so I'm seeing all my layers again, I'm pretty sure that's everything that had an effect, an adjustment layer, any kind of adjustment to it, and we're back to where we started. So this is where we started, that is where we ended up. So obviously that is a very dramatic difference that this has made, and it's really brought everything together to feel like a much more polished piece that's in line with the brand. Everything's much warmer now, and these elements don't feel just so cut and paste on top of each other. Now that that's all done, I can export this and get it to my creative director. So I'm going to come up to File, Export, Export As. And this is kind of similar to the way that Illustrator handles exporting artboards. As you can see, this is showing me artboard 1. So if I had multiple artboards in my document, I could export them at the same time. But with this artboard selected, I'm going to make sure that my format is set to JPEG. And I'm going to turn my quality up to 100 just so it's maximum quality. And I'm going to get a little preview here of about how big the image is going to be in the file size. So 1.9 megabytes. That's perfectly great. It's a nice high quality. My image size is 100%, 1920 by 1080. So I know all of that's great. Now I can't change the name of my artboard, so I'm actually going to hit cancel real quick, and I'll just rename this Bartleman's Style Frame 01. And then I'll again go up to File, Export, Export As, and now the file name is going to be the name of that artboard. Everything else, oh, it looks like my quality went down to 80. I'll turn that back up to 100. Everything else should be great. I'll click on Export All, and this will allow me to put it on the desktop. I'll click Save, and there we go. There's my exported frame that I can now send off to my creative director. Now, I am not finished with my work, however. I've got 2 more style frames that have been put on my workload, so I'm going to go through these now and show you some more tips and tricks inside of Photoshop. And I'm going to go through these next 2 a little bit more quickly since we've gotten a pretty good overview of how this all works. I'll be applying a lot of the same techniques, but also be implementing some new ones. So I'll go slower as we do some new things, but some of this might even be sped up so that you don't have to watch the entire process all over again. The first of the 2 projects that I want to work on is right here. This is for a product called Snifflin. So let me open up the brand brief right here that they gave me. This is going to be a nasal spray for allergies, and they want a style frame just like the Bartleman's ad for the end of their advertisement. So I've got some colors that I can work with. I'm going to make 1 style frame. I've got some tagline information, and my creative director again has given me a sample layout. So we've got a photo of a model on the right side. We've got some text, "Get the relief you deserve," coming out from behind her head, it looks like. And the creative director drew this on a slant, so I'm assuming that this is probably going to be a box that's containing the text, but that's something that I guess I get to play around with. We've got the product box and the spray bottle, so the actual container for the box and then the spray bottle itself. And it looks like we've got some more text down here that says, "From the makers of Allergon, and that's in parentheses logo, so I guess we're going to have another logo there. And then the second line is use as directed, so that's like, I think, a disclaimer. They probably have to legally put that on there. Okay, so if we take a look at the additional information, we've got some font information, so okay, that's great. I can pull everything from there. Alright, so let's take a look at the stock and the logos and things that they've given us. On my desktop here, I've got the Snifflin folder, so we've got the Allergon logo, so that's this line right here from the makers of Allergon. I've got the Snifflin bottle, so there's another product render of the actual nasal spray. I've got the Snifflin box, so I'm guessing that's the front side of the box. The Snifflin logo, and I think that might be it. Yep, so we've got the two different logos, product box, and my layout. Okay, and then we have this folder called stock with 4 images in it. So let me bring all of these up at once. It looks like they've got 4 different shots of the same model, and they're all composed very similarly. So we've got the stock model on the right side. So I guess I have a little bit of creative freedom on which photo I want to use, but we can see that the model obviously was on that side. Now, I'm assuming that this is actually something that they want to see the actual background. I'm not going to be cutting the person out of the background and generating a background. Because it's an allergy nasal spray, it would make sense to show somebody out in nature where you might have allergies. So I think I'm going to be incorporating graphics on top of this, these photographs, as if it was footage. So you know, that's the way that this type of thing usually works, is that before you go to actually shoot any video for a commercial, they'll just mock something up with stock photography so that the client can get an idea of what it might look like before you actually spend all the money and time it takes to go film something yourself. So out of these 4 photos, I mean, I think that this one right here is the most flattering. It's a nice close-up. It's not, you know, this mid-running jog shot. She's got a really nice smile. So I think that's the one that I want to work with. It gives me plenty of room on this side to put all of the other elements according to this style frame layout, I think. So let's go with that one, and I'll start chugging away. So first, I'm going to come into Photoshop, close this one out, and make sure it's saved. And I'll make a new document, and this will again be a 1920 by 1080 web large, and I'm going to make sure my color profile is sRGB. There we go. Click create, and then I can start working. Now I want to bring in that photo, so I'm going to go to File, Place Embedded, and then find that photo on my desktop. Be this one right here, and click on Place. And then I want to make sure that that fills the frame. Now I could scale this up, or I could just come up to right here where it's got a percentage. Make sure that the width and height are linked together. And then on the width, just type in 1920 px for pixels, and then that will size it up perfectly to fit the width of my document. I'll click the check mark to apply that transformation. That made it a smart object because I placed an embedded photo. And then maybe just move this down a little bit. Press V to move to my move tool, and then just drag that down a little bit so we're not cutting off the top of her head. Now I just want to rename this and call this model. And this photo is really color corrected very nicely. I don't think I'm going to have to do any manipulations to the color itself. So let's just start laying the other elements in and see how we can make it all feel like it's a cohesive piece. So I'm going to bring in, let's see, we need the product box, the spray bottle, and then this logo for Allergon. So I'm going to go up to File, Place Embedded again, and find the product box. There we go, click Place, and I'll scale that down a little bit, move it about where I think it needs to be, and click the check mark. And that's named properly. It's a smart object. Good to go. I'll place the other element of the spray bottle, Snifflin nasal spray. Scale that down as well. It looks like this image has a bunch of empty transparency to it. That's why the box out here isn't contained to the bottle itself. Not necessarily an issue, but that's why that's happening. I'll make that about the same height as the box and then move it over. So there we go, Snifflin bottle. And then we're going to need that Allergon logo, so let me place that. Place embedded. Allergon logo, and this is an Illustrator layer, and it's a green color, so I'm going to assume that's the correct color. Click on place, and then say the bounding box is fine. Click OK. There we go. We've got that, and I'll scale that down. That's probably going to be pretty small. Because it's vector, I can increase or decrease it as much as I want. And let me just take a look at the brand guide. It looks like this green right here is probably that same green. Yeah, so that's great. I don't have to worry about that color at all. And just taking a look at this side by side with my document here. So I've got that, and I've got the style frame layout. I think I've got the main elements, at least the ones that are already created, already on there. So I've got the photo with the model on the right side. I've got the product box. I've got the spray bottle, and then the Allergon logo down here that I have to put some more text on. But now I can start kind of just fitting this in. I need to put that main text of "Get the relief you deserve" up here, probably right in here. So these two elements definitely need to be smaller. I'll select both of them, clicking on the first one, holding Shift, and clicking on the second one, and then just start scaling this down while holding Shift. Maybe about that big. I don't know. We'll start there and then place the rest of the elements and see how it works out. Alright, now that that's all set up, let's add the big text, because I think that's the main element that's kind of going to determine where all of this other stuff ends up. First of all, what does the text say? It says, "Get the relief you deserve," and it looks like probably wants it on 2 lines. It looks like my creative director wrote it on 2 lines and he marked it down here as 2 lines, so that's how I'm going to do it. So let's get our type tool here and then type out "Get the relief," drop down a line by pressing enter and saying "You deserve," and click the check mark. Now this is way too big, so I'm just going to scale this down pretty small and bring up my text panel right here. Make sure that my leading is set to auto, and that way it's going to be based on the size of the text and not a fixed number. Next up, I don't think that I'm going to want this center justified, but I also don't know that I want it right or left justified. This might be better if it was right justified. I don't know. I guess that really depends on the font that we use. So let's take a look at the brand guide. This is saying that our tagline should be set in vinyl OT oblique. From the makers of Allergon should be set in vinyl OT regular. Okay, so vinyl. Let's see if I already have it. I'll just type in vinyl. Yep, there we go. Vinyl OT oblique. Okay, so that's what that looks like. I think I could probably make this bigger. This is the tagline. You probably want to see this nice, big, and bold. And I'm going to zoom out pretty far just so we can kind of get a different perspective of how this text is reading. Again, comparing this to the layout that my creative director gave me, I think that's probably taking up about the same amount of space that he's imagining. Again, this is not a direct, perfect layout for what I'll be building. I still need to use my own judgment and decide how this text looks and how all these other elements are working together. But I'm going to try and follow it as best as I can. So I think that text looks pretty good right there, but the gap between lines is kind of big, so I think I do want to adjust that leading. I'll zoom in here nice and close, and then with that text layer selected, I'll change it from auto to say 72. And actually, that's what it was set to because my font size is 72. So I'm going to change that down to maybe 60. And I didn't even have my text layer selected. That's important. Make sure your text layer is selected, and I'll change that to 60. Okay, obviously that's a little too much, so I'm just going to select that again, and then maybe just increase this. I'm using the up arrow with that text layer selected. I'm going to hold down Shift to increment that by 10s, and I don't know, somewhere around there looks pretty good to me. So I'm going to call that good. And actually, I'm just going to be a little anal. I'm going to round that off to 100. There we go. Okay, so that text is laid out. I kind of like the way that it looks when it's right justified, where the right edges of the 2 lines are lined up. So now it's just a matter of placement of all the different objects and some of the other elements. Like, I'm pretty sure, like I said, that this is supposed to be within a box and slanted there. I don't know if that's going to work at the same angle, maybe going in the opposite direction, or maybe I can break it up into 2 different, I don't know, I'll play around with it. But before I do anything else, I need to save. So I'm going to just stick this on my desktop into the Snifflin folder. I'll call this Snifflin style frame 01. Alright, now that's backed up, good to go, and I can move on. Why don't I get some of this stuff laid out a little bit better? Bring this up and over, and then type out the text that's going to go down here. So this is where it's going to say, from the makers of Allergon, and that needs to be in a specific font. From the makers of Allergon should be set in Vinyl OT regular and use the Allergon logo. So from the makers of in Vinyl OT and then regular. So I'll type that out. From the makers of, and this can be left justified. Apply that, and I think I just need to scale this down. Command T to transform and scale that down. And it's in all caps right now, and that's just because it's left over from when I did this text, which was left over from the last time I used the text tool. But I think up here that works really well, having that all caps, that big display, all caps font really works for that section of text because that's what we want the viewer to read first. But down here it kind of is bothering me that it's all caps. Like it's almost like it's yelling when it's all caps like that. It's trying to get your attention, and I kind of want that to be secondary to everything else on screen. So I think I'm going to take the all caps off and even see if like lowercase everything, that might be good. I think that actually looks pretty good. Now I just got to line it up with this logo in a way that has a good balance. So maybe scaling that logo down a little bit, putting those two together, and then lining it up with the left edge of the box. Something like that. Yeah, okay, that looks pretty good. And then the other text that I need to apply is disclaimer. Use only as directed. So I'm just going to copy and paste that in. Must be included at the base of the frame. And that needs to be a different font too. But I'm going to duplicate this layer. Quick way to duplicate is just hold down Option with the Move tool and click and drag, just like in Illustrator when you're duplicating any object. And I'll paste this in. Select all is Command A, and then paste is Command V. So there we go. I've got that new text, but that's supposed to be in a different font. The disclaimer must be set in Korolev compressed medium. Okay, Korolev. So type that in. Whoa, there's a lot of versions of this font. Korolev compressed medium. There we go. Okay, so there's that. This probably should be a little bigger, just from my own experience. I feel like that little disclaimer needs to be readable, but not distracting, and I feel like it's going to need to be have a little bit more importance than from the makers of Allergon. So I'm going to move some of these layers around just to give myself some more space, and then maybe, I don't know, line it up right about there. Look at this as a whole, zoom in and out. It's always a good idea to look at your designs at different zoom levels just so you can get a feel for how something is reading depending on how far away you're looking at it. But looking at it right about there, you can still read everything great. I think that's good. Maybe move these over just a little bit. Okay, save. And I think the next step will be figuring out what to do with the box around this text. Looking at the style guide or style frame guide from my creative director, it looks like that's going behind the head of the model. So that's going to be an interesting little challenge, because this photo we're not manipulating really. We just want it to make it look like this graphic is existing in this photo. So I need to get it to go behind the model's head, but still have it appear like it's part of the scene. So first things first, I got to make a box. So I think I'm going to do this using vector tools. So I'm going to come over to my shape tools and into my rectangle tool, and I'm just going to make a box around the top line. Click and drag just like you would in Illustrator. And because I want this to go behind the head of the model, I'm just going to extend this out far enough that it would overlap. And actually, I just drew that as a path and not a shape. So I'm going to just delete that real quick and redo that. I'm going to change this from path to shape, and that way it's going to add a fill or a stroke, whatever we have set up here, to it as I draw. So I'm going to try that again. Draw my shape out, And there we go. Now I've got a rectangle layer. I'm going to drag that down below that text, get the relief you deserve, and then I need it to be a different text or a different color than the text. So I think if we look at the color palette, we've got the dark green from the box, we've got the lighter green of this, and then a yellow, and I'm guessing, yeah, that must be an off-white. So actually, let me bring this PDF in so I can reference these colors. Place embedded, bring that PDF in right there, and there's no background, so that makes it a little interesting, but all I'm interested in are these colors right here. So first of all, I want to make sure these text layers are exactly that color. I think that is going to be my white that I'll be using. So I'm going to press I on the keyboard to get to my eyedropper and sample that color. That just loads it into my foreground color. It doesn't apply it to anything. But then with this text selected, I'm going to fill with Option Delete. And there we go. We can see that color has updated. It's very, very subtle because of this background color. But if I undo and redo, you can see that color popping back in. So I think that must have been pure white before. And then I'll just fill that on the other two text layers as well. So there we go. Now I know that all my text layers are using the right brand color for sniffling. And then why don't we pick a different color for this rectangle? So eyedropper tool again with that layer selected, and let's try filling it with this dark green. Okay, that's not a bad option. Definitely goes along with the box here, but I'm curious what would happen if we used this lighter green, which is the same as the Allergon logo. Now, obviously, that's not going to work with the light colored text, but if I were to change that to be something darker, like maybe just sampling one of these dark green colors of the background, because you can sample any color you want here. Maybe that one right there, and then fill. Then it almost looks like there's a hole punching through that rectangle, and I kind of like that. And through some trickery, we actually can get that to happen, where the text is actually punching a hole through the rectangle. So for now, I'm just going to leave it as the fill color, and we'll come back to it. I think that's going to work fine. I'm going to save this up here at the top and just hide it, just in case I need to sample any colors again. But now I need to move on and make another rectangle for the second line. So I can do this a couple different ways. I could duplicate the rectangle and have two of them, just by duplicating it like this. That makes a different copy of the layer. Or I could actually copy the path. So I pressed A to get to my selection tool. I'll click on the path once, copy, and paste. And that pastes right where you copied from. That's something that's a little bit different in Photoshop with vector paths. For whatever reason, when you paste, it does not place it right in the center. It's going to paste it wherever it was when you copied it. But then I'm just going to drag it down, and you can see that now there are two paths existing on this same shape layer. So that's kind of convenient. I'll bring this up so that we have kind of the same amount of space on the top of the text as the bottom of the text. And then I just need to bring this side in a little bit. So I'm going to Shift A to get to my direct selection tool and select those two corners, and then just bring them in while holding Shift to make sure I'm only moving it left and right. So something like that. I'll press Enter to apply that. And I think I want to bring this edge of the top box down a little bit. Just like maybe that much. Okay, so there I've got my text box with the text inside of it, and I'm just going to go ahead and group these so that I don't lose track of it. Just a little bit better organization. Command G with both of those selected, and we'll just call this the tagline. Alright, so that's my group, and now I need to get the part of this box that would be going behind the model's head to disappear. So this is, again, one of those things that there's probably 10 different ways that you could approach masking this off. We've already covered how to mask something off with the pen tool, but one of the most powerful features of Photoshop is its ability to make selections of images, of pixels, and differentiate between a subject and a background. It's one of the things that just makes Photoshop an amazing tool to work with. So the way that we're going to need to work with this is by making a mask around the model's head. So if I turn this off for a second, we need this edge right here. And one way we could do this is using the lasso tool. You saw me use that just a little bit ago. If I could, grab the lasso tool and just draw a line by hand, but I'm telling you, this is not a very precise way of doing this at all. So there I made a little bit of selection. I definitely cut off some of her head here so I could, again, just hold down Shift and add to my selection and bring this in a little bit more and just try and perfect this as much as possible. But I'm telling you, it's not going to look that great, and it is not a very quick process. There's another selection tool, though, that is really great for making selections like this, and it's called the Magic Wand. If I press W or just come over to here, and we see these two different tools, Magic Wand and Quick Selection Tool. I can click on the Magic Wand and make sure that my layer that I'm wanting to select is active. W for the shortcut for Magic Wand. I can make a selection of similar pixels. So if I were to click on her face, you can see that it made a selection of colors similar to what I clicked on. So I could do this in her eyes, on her lips, I could do it on her hair, and sometimes it's going to select more things than other, like this green patch here. And there it selected a whole lot. But if we look at the options up here in the top, there's a tolerance setting, and I could change this to something like 30, double what it was, and now it's going to select a lot more. So it's selecting pixels that are more similar than what I had before. If I turned it up to 50, it would be even more sensitive and be able to just grab a whole bunch of pixels all at once. I can also hold down Shift to add to my selection, or the Option or Alt key to remove from my selection. So that's one way that we could also do this. But again, this isn't extremely precise, and there are better tools for making these types of selections, which brings me straight to the Quick Selection tool. And this is the one that I'm using probably more often than anything else when trying to select a subject in a photo, especially a person with this nice blurry green background. So I'm going to deselect my selection, Command D. And the way that this tool works is kind of like a brush. You can control the radius of the brush with the left and right brackets, so I can make this bigger or smaller. And we have some controls up here, like sample all layers, so it doesn't have to just sample the one that you have selected, and auto enhance. Now, auto enhance is great because it can kind of detect edges and refine your selection to just make it smoother and cleaner than if you were to just do it with that unchecked. So I'm going to keep that checked for now, and I'll show you how it works. I'm just going to click and drag and kind of paint around the area that I want selected. You can see that this is kind of just magically popping in every part of this model in the photo. It's leaving the background out. So it's kind of intelligently identifying what I want selected, and very quickly like that I was able to make this selection around the entire subject. To be able to see a kind of a better preview of what your selection is, you can press Q on the keyboard, and this is quick mask mode, which I don't really use. I'm not going to explain how it works, but you can see this red overlay. Everything that you see that's tinted red is not selected, so everything that's clear is. And you just press Q to jump out of that one more time. But that's how the Quick Selection tool works. So now that I have that selection, I can now go back onto my tagline and add a layer mask. And just like adding a mask to any layer, you can add a mask to a group. So I'm just going to go ahead and do that to the entire group here. With that group selected, I'll click on the mask button, and it makes a mask based on the selection I had. Now, this is inverted. It kept what was within the selection, so it was doing what it should have, but I want it to be opposite. So I'm going to invert my mask just by coming up right here in my Properties panel and clicking on Invert. There we go. Now we're left with just the part of this box that we need to see, and it kind of looks like it's going behind her head. But if I zoom in nice and close, you can see that it's not 100% clean. If I look at it at 100%, it is a little bit rough, and we can do a little bit to make this look a little cleaner. For one, I could add a little bit of a feather. I don't want to do too much. I don't want it to look like it's, fading into her head like that. But I could just bump it up to maybe half a pixel. And just that little bit softens the edge. Another thing I could do is turn that off and then click on that mask, and with my Quick Selection tool active, click on Select and Mask. And what this is going to do is open up an entire new, basically, system of Photoshop. It's leaving what we were working in behind and giving me new tools and adjustments to refine my selection even further. And because I already had that mask applied to the layer, it loaded that mask in as a selection. And currently I'm viewing this in a way that's very much like that quick mask mode that I showed you when you press Q. It's overlaying red on what's not visible within my mask. But we can change our view right up here. There's lots of different ways to view your selection. So overlay is what it's set to, but you can also just view it as a normal selection. We could see it on top of black. And this even has some further controls where you can control the opacity, completely making what shouldn't be there black. You could also make it white. You could view it as just the black and white mask, and you can toggle through these very quickly just by pressing F or Shift F to go back in the other direction. So I think this mode right here is going to be fine. Let's take a look at some of the other controls. We've got edge detection, and this is again just another kind of smart, intelligent way for Photoshop to try and guess what the edge of your selection should look like. You can also turn on smart radius, which is something that takes a little bit more processing power, but I'm just going to turn that down to 0 for now and collapse that up, and then look at these global refinements. And this is where we can really make some nice adjustments. So the first one is smooth. If I turn this way up, you can see how that's affecting the edge. And why don't I just turn this to the pure black mode, so you can really see just how much it cleaned that up. If I turn it back down to 0, we've got these little edge kind of artifacts is a way to refer to that, where it's kind of a little bit jagged. So I could just smooth that out even just a little bit. I don't have to go crazy, but just 4, 5, 8 really does a nice job of smoothing it out. I also can feather this out if I want, or I could add contrast so that it's much cleaner and much crisper. And I don't want to make it 100% crisp like this, where you're seeing kind of these stair-step jagged pixel edges, but I also don't think I want it to be quite as soft as it is. So I'm going to just increase the contrast a little bit of my mask, and then take a look at my other views to see how that's working. That's pretty good. And this view in particular is on layers, so it's giving me a direct preview of what my mask will look like if I were to just hit OK. So I think this is the view I want to work in for now. And then we have this shift edge. This is a really useful feature. You can see that I can kind of just push or pull the edge of my mask out or in a little bit. So I don't want to really mess with this much, but maybe I should pull it out just a little bit further on the negative, because if I set this back down to 0, you can see that shape is kind of overlapping her hair a little bit. So maybe I'll back that up just a touch, and then take down some of that contrast so that it blends into her hair just a little bit more. Okay, so that looks pretty good. If I click this checkbox right here, I can see what it was like and what we've done to it. So it is a subtle adjustment, but it definitely did clean up my mask a little. So now that that's done, I'll click, or I'll take a look at my output settings, and it's set to outputting to a layer mask. There are different options in there. If you're ever messing with this, you can export it to a selection, to a new layer. There's lots of different options, but I'm going to leave that as layer mask and click OK. And now I can undo and redo and see that difference. So I have a little bit cleaner mask now. That's a really great way to be able to clean up your masks. Great, so that's working pretty well, but I want to take a look at this style guide from my creative director one more time. This angled line is really indicating to me that my creative director didn't want to just have a straight edge on the text right here. That was something he was thinking as a design element could look cool if we angled this bar. So I'm going to try and recreate that somehow. I don't think I'm going to be able to do a straight edge, but maybe I can angle both of these since I'm using this italic font. Maybe that's what he was thinking. Maybe he had seen this font and he realized this italic font that's leaning a little bit, we could match the shape of the box that's containing it to just fit that angle a little bit better. So I'm going to go into my rectangle, and I'm going to grab this point on the bottom here, hold shift and click on that point at the same time, and then just tap this over with the left arrow, and it's going to ask me, are you okay with converting this from a live shape into a regular path? Yes, I am. And I'm just going to tap this over until it matches that angle pretty well. I think that's pretty good. Now I just want to bring all of this in a little bit so that it's a little bit closer to the text, and press enter. And I think that actually works pretty well. Maybe the spacing between the two lines needs to be a little bit bigger, because I don't like how close the tops of these letters are to the bottom of this box edge. So I'm going to just space that out a little bit more. So let me grab that text layer, open this up, and then maybe increase this to say 120, or maybe just 110 would be good. I think that's pretty good. And then I just need to adjust my rectangle. So I'm going to grab this one and tap it down a little bit. And then maybe just pull this side out a little bit as well. I think there's more space between this edge and this G and than there is between this edge and this Y, or there was. That is actually looking pretty decent. I think I'm happy with the way that looks. But it could all move over to the right a little bit. There's a lot of space between her head and this text compared to the edges of these shapes in the text. So I'm just going to grab the whole group and move it over. But, oh, that's not going to work because it's moving the mask with it. So this actually brings up a good point. If I undo, so we're back to where we were, this little chain link is a link between the mask and what it's applied to. But you can click on that link to unlink the two, and then you can move the mask independently from the layer, or vice versa. So right now I have my mask selected, but if I click on the group icon and then move everything over, you can see that my mask is staying right where it is. So that's important to know how to do, and that's what I want. Now that that's all set, I can zoom out and just take a look, but I think that's going to work just great. Next up, I want to get this text to actually be punching a hole through this rectangle. So I've got this one text layer, and I have the rectangle behind it, but it's not actually punching a hole, it's just a dark green. Well, we already know how to make a clipping mask to contain something within another layer, but how can we kind of reverse that to where what is overlapping isn't being seen at all? Unfortunately, it is not a very straightforward thing. This is actually something that was a challenge to me to figure out how to get to work, and it's a little bit convoluted. So let me just show you what you need to do to get this to happen, and then we'll talk about it a little bit. So first of all, I'm going to click on this text layer, and there are two different ways of showing visibility of any layer in Photoshop. The first is the opacity, which we've already talked about a little bit. I can drop this down just like in Illustrator to any opacity, and it will show through to the layers behind it. But there's also underneath that a fill, and I can turn this down, and it seems like it's doing the exact same thing, and visually it is. But the way that you can think about this is, you know how in Illustrator you can have a path that doesn't have a fill or stroke on it, it's just an empty path that you don't see? You can kind of think of fill like that. Photoshop is treating it as pixels that still exist, but it's not showing them. So I'm going to turn my fill all the way down, and then I'm going to add a layer style by double-clicking on this section of the layer. And under this default tab that it opens up to, Blending Options, I'm going to come down to this option right here, which is called Knockout. If I grab that knockout, we have two different options. Well, three options: None, Shallow, and Deep. So these didn't make much sense to me at first, but I chose the first one, Shallow. And sure enough, that knocked out a hole using that layer as a hole punch, basically. So that's working. I can click OK, and that works great. But let me show you something interesting. If I ungroup this layer by pressing Command-Shift-G, then my text turns white. I'm not seeing the picture behind the text anymore. And if I go into my artboard options, my background color is set to white, but if I change it to transparent, you can actually see this is punching a hole not only through the shape below it, but all the way through to the background. So I'll undo to get back to where it was working, and the key difference here is that it's within a group. If I bring it out of the group, it's going to again punch a hole all the way into the background. No matter what is below it, you're not going to see anything that's behind that layer. So the fix is to put it back into that group. And just as a little side note, if we double click on this again, the difference between shallow and deep is that deep is going to still punch a hole through to the background even if it's grouped. So that's kind of how you can think of it. It's knocking out a shallow hole only into the contents of the group that it's part of, or it's knocking out a deep hole all the way through no matter what it's contained within. So again, this is a very convoluted process that took me a while to figure out, but it's a great a good example of how sometimes you just have to be a problem solver and figure something out like this in Photoshop. And if you can't figure it out on your own, Google is absolutely your friend. You can pretty much search for how to do anything in any Adobe program, and somebody else on the internet has asked the question. Adobe has a great set of forums with active members of Adobe's team trying to help people solve problems, and the help files for these programs are also really, really thorough and great. So if you ever see a feature and you don't know how it works, you don't know what it does, you can just come up to help, go to Photoshop help, and search for that specific tool and get a great description of how it works. So just realize that you're going to have to start becoming an actual problem solver when you're using these programs. They're very complex, very deep, and there's no way you're ever going to learn every single aspect of these programs. There's stuff in Photoshop I've never even touched, and I've been using it for over a decade. So just realize that these programs are so deep, and every now and then you're going to learn something that you wish you would have known a long time ago. I wish I would have known this a long time ago for sure. But now that we've got it working, that text is laid out fairly well. I like how it's punching the hole through the shape behind it. We can work on these other elements. Now obviously this element is super dark compared to everything else, so I think I'm going to start by just brightening this up. And to make things simple, I'm just going to apply a curves adjustment directly to the layer since it is a smart object. So I'm going to come up to Image, Adjust, and then Curves. And actually, you know what? I'm going to take this as an opportunity to show you another adjustment, which is called Levels. So I'm going to come up to Image Mode, or Image Adjust Levels. And this is another way to manipulate the brightness of an image. So just like curves had a point on the darks and a point on the whites, the levels gives you a histogram exactly the same way, with a slider on the left for the darks and a slider on the right for the whites. And then it gives you one right in the middle for your midtones. So you can kind of manipulate the brightness of this of the image a little bit differently than you can with curves. You can do a lot of the same things. Most of the time I'm using curves because it's just much more precise. You can do a lot more fine-tuned adjustments by adding as many points as you want on that curve. But every now and then, Levels gets the job done, and it's very straightforward. It's another way to be able to manipulate things. So I'm just going to kind of bring this up until it looks a little bit brighter, something that matches the brightness of the scene a little bit more. And using the mids, I can add in a little bit of contrast as well. So I think I'm happy with that. I can turn the preview off and back on. That looks pretty good. Click OK. And honestly, this is looking pretty good. I'm happy with the way that it's turning out. There's some more little adjustments that I can make to blend everything together, but the thing that I'm seeing the most right now is that these products are pretty small and the text is pretty big. So I think I want to just scale this down a little bit and scale the product up a little bit. So let's start with the tagline. And again, I do not want this to be linked, and I want to make sure that I'm not adjusting the mask, just the group. I'll press Command T to transform, and then maybe just scale this down a little bit and bring it out away from her head just a tad. Something like that. I'll apply that transformation, and then I'll just grab these two products right here and scale them up just a little bit and fit them a little bit more centered between these two things, just so they're a little bit more prominent. I think that's great. Now, the little finishing touches I can make are, again, that light wrap. So I'm going to add a layer style to the Snifflin bottle. Add that inner glow. It's going to remember the settings that I had from last time. This time, instead of this orange, I'm just going to grab one of these green colors. And actually, that's a little dark. Maybe I'll just brighten it up. And turn up the opacity so I can see it nice and clear. The size of it, I think, works pretty well, so I'll just tone that down a little bit. But that just tiny little subtle adjustment is going to bring in a little bit of green from the rest of the image. And then for this box, because it's just a flat graphic right now, I want to add just a little bit of depth around the edges of it so that it looks a little more three-dimensional, like it's actually the product box. To do that, I'm going to again go into my layer style, double-click on that layer. This time I'm going to come to Bevel and Emboss. And right away you can see what that's doing. It's adding a little bit of an edge all the way around. It's adding some highlights here, some shadows here, and then some shading on the left and right edges as well. I can make this bigger and even more depthy so you can really see what's going on. This can look really fake really quickly, But there are a whole bunch of options. I'm not going to cover them all right now, but I will just show you what I want to do. I basically just want to give a very small edge, so I'm going to turn my size down to, say, 2 pixels. That looks pretty good. And then turn the depth way down as well. I just want this nice, subtle edge. Turn that off and back on. And then I want to come down to the shading of the highlight and the shadow and turn their opacities down just a little bit. I can really turn it up to make that top edge brighter, but I think something right around 40, 47 looks good. The shadow's a little dark. I think I'll just back that off so it's not quite as noticeable. And then maybe I can bump up the size just a little bit. Again, I don't want this to look super fake like that. I just want to give it the slightest bit of a highlight and a shadow. Click OK, and I think that's looking pretty good. And maybe I want to put the same light wrap that I put on the bottle on the box. Now, I can't copy and paste the layer style like I did before because that will replace the layer style that I've already set up. But I can hold down Option, click and drag that inner glow from one layer to the other, and then it will copy it over for me. So that's adding quite a bit more than I want. So I'm going to go into that inner glow and then maybe size it up a little and then turn the opacity down a little. So that's with it off and back on. Just gives it a nice little bit of a glowy edge there. But I think that's going to do it. I think these elements are all working well together now, and I can move on to the final touches. Now, another thing that Photoshop is known for is photoshopping an image. When somebody says that that image looks photoshopped, it's because people have gotten used to the idea that Photoshop can manipulate images to appear in a certain way that aren't necessarily realistic. So I'm going to just really quickly show you some things that we can do to this image using some other tools inside of Photoshop. And I think a good example might be some of these stray hairs on the side of her head. So these hairs right here, maybe let's say that the client isn't very happy with how she had so many stray hairs over here. We want to make it look a little bit more perfect. Well, if I click on that layer, I can't actually manipulate any of the pixels without something like an effect or an adjustment layer because it's a smart object. So what I actually have to do is go into my smart object and manipulate the pixels here. Now this is a little bit dangerous because if I do any adjustments in here that are destructive and I save this smart object and go back into my main document, they're gone. I would have to undo in that document to be able to get back to the original image. So the first thing I want to do is just duplicate this layer so I have the backup on that background copy. If I ever mess something up too much on this copy, I can just reduplicate the original. Alright, so now that that's done, let's just take a look at this section of hair right here and think about how we might remove it. Well, there are a number of different tools for doing this type of thing in Photoshop. The first one that I want to talk about is called the clone stamp, which is right here. That's this icon. The shortcut is S, and what this allows you to do is choose a portion of the image that you want to sample and then paint that portion of the image, or paint from that point of the image on another section. Now this is going to be a little bit weird, but I think it's going to be a good use case to be able to show you an example of exactly what I'm talking about. I'm going to give this model a third eye right in the middle of her forehead. So I'm going to grab that clone stamp tool, S on the keyboard, and then the way that this works is you start by holding Option or Alt, and it gives you a little crosshair. And this is where you're setting your sample point, kind of like the eyedropper tool. So I'm just going to click right in the middle of her eye, and then I'll let go of Option or Alt, and you can see that I have a preview now in my brush of where I had clicked. So I can go to wherever I want to start painting, and then click and just continue to paint, circling out from the center, and sure enough, just like that, I was easily able to add a third eye to the center of her forehead. I realize how creepy that is and how weird that looks, but that is how the clone stamp tool works. So I'm going to undo that horrendous image right there and now show you how that works over on this hair. So let's say I want to paint out this hair in the same way. Well, pressing S on the keyboard to get to that tool, I first want to set my sample point to something near what would be behind that hair. So this green over here is probably going to work fine. I'll click and then come over here and just start painting out the hair a little bit at a time. And depending on where you're sampling from, you can see that I'm getting that little crosshair showing me where I am sampling from. This may or may not work out very well. I can always resample just by holding Option again and clicking. So I can make sure, like this part right here sampled some of this dark green, so maybe I want to go over that with some lighter green. I can blend this together, and you can do this with any brush, just like you can paint with any brush. So if I come up here, I can control how soft or hard my brush is. Generally, soft brushes are going to give you better results for this type of thing because it's going to blend the edges in a little bit better. I can make my brush bigger or smaller using the left and right bracket keys, and then just paint larger areas at a time. And generally, this will get the job done. So I'm just going to finish this off. Oops, I did a little too much there. But I'm just going to finish this off, get rid of these strands, and I think I'm going to call that good. Alright, so there's one technique for being able to remove something like hair. But let's say we want to get rid of some of the hair that's on her shoulder now. Well, I could use this same clone stamp tool, sample this part of her arm, and then start to paint this out, continuing to resample, and that kind of worked, but I kind of went over the edge a little bit. It takes a lot more work to make this realistic when you're dealing with things like skin tone. Like if I were to come over to this strand of hair right here and use the clone stamp tool, it's going to be very noticeable as I'm sampling over here that this is not working out at all. That doesn't look natural. It's totally fake. So let me undo that and show you another tool that might do a little bit better job. This right here is some more advanced pixel manipulation tools. The one I want to talk about right now is called the Healing Brush tool. This is similar to the clone stamp tool. If I make the brush bigger, you're seeing a sample of a portion of the image, and you set that sample the same way. So let's do the eye again. I'll just hold Option or Alt, click on that point, and then I'm going to make this brush a little bit less hard. It's 100% hardness. I'm just going to turn the softness all the way up, and then I'm just going to paint in again. Now you'll notice this is not doing it exactly the same way as the clone stamp. It's appearing to blend it a little bit more, and it actually looks a lot more convincing, like she actually has a third eye right in the center of her forehead. Let me duplicate this background again and redo that with the clone stamp tool so we can compare what this looks like versus what the healing brush looks like. So there we go. That's the clone stamp, and that is the healing brush. So if we take a look at this edge right here with the clone stamp, it's literally just grabbing these pixels and slapping them right there wherever I painted them in. But if I turn this off and we take a look at the healing brush, it's not only moved these pixels over there, but it's taken the edge pixels and literally blended it in for me much more naturally. So this is something that can produce much more realistic effects. It's working a lot more with textures and blending values together rather than just directly copying one thing over to the other. I'm going to delete those two layers and duplicate this one more time, and now show you how that healing brush tool might work on some of these hairs a little bit better. So I'll grab the healing brush and say get rid of some of these hairs. I'm just going to do a little bit at a time, and I've found pretty useful to sample a different point every time you brush, because one thing that is different between this and the clone stamp is that if I sample once and brush, and then I move up without sampling and I brush again, see that sample point is still from the exact same spot. Now on this particular case, the background texture is what I'm sampling. It's all very similar, so it worked out. But if I were trying to remove, pimples from somebody's face, and I kept sampling the exact same patch of skin for every pimple, that might be noticeable. So I found that it's just a good practice to set a different sample point for every stroke that you make. Now as I'm doing this on the hair, you'll see that it is blending those colors in a little bit better than before, but I'm still making just little adjustments at a time, trying to add a new sample point every time that I make a brush stroke. And even though this does do a much better job, it's not necessarily the most natural looking thing. You can see that this is much darker and it's not working out that great. So maybe I'll take this brush, now that I've removed the hair, and increase the size of it a little bit and just do this nice big stroke like that. And now that's smoothed it out quite a bit. Could definitely use some more work, but that is a great way of being able to remove something like unwanted hair. I'll delete that layer, duplicate it one more time, and point out a few more tools. Underneath this healing brush tool, we also have the spot healing brush tool, and you can kind of think of this like a quick healing brush tool. Instead of choosing the sample that you're brushing with, it's basically going to look around where you're brushing and try to find an appropriate texture. So if I just bring this down a little bit and maybe try painting on this hair, it's going to kind of just estimate where it should be pulling that sample from. And if I turn that hardness down, it might look a little bit better. And doing, again, smaller samples or smaller brush strokes at a time instead of really large areas often will produce better results. But like I said, this is kind of like a quick healing brush tool. I don't use it as much because I like to have the control of where it's actually sampling from. So let's get back to where we were and then take a look at another option. We have the patch tool. This is kind of a similar thing to the healing brush tool, but it works in a different way. If I click and drag, it'll allow me to draw a selection just like the lasso tool. And then I can take a look at some options up here. Right now I have source and destination. Destination is what I have selected right now, and what this is going to do is allow me to click and drag, and then when I let go, it's going to blend everything in together. So that's actually a really easy way of being able to do something like give somebody a third eye. But if I were to change it to source instead, it's going to do something a little bit creepy, so prepare yourself. Instead of taking the eye and moving to the forehead, I'm moving my selection to what I want to sample and replace what I had selected. So it's going to take the forehead and remove her eye. Be prepared, this is a little creepy. Alright, so she only has one eye now. I'm going to undo so we don't have to look at that anymore, but that is how the patch healing tool, or the patch tool works. I believe it's just called the patch tool. Yep. Now there's some other tools in here. We don't really need to focus on them right now. They're more seldomly used, but that's a quick overview, a very quick overview of the crazy manipulation tools that you have access to inside of Photoshop. So back to what we were originally trying to do. Let me remove some of these hairs, and I think I'm just going to use the healing brush tool, make some broad strokes here, and very quickly be able to paint out these hairs. So let me just make my brush a little bit smaller, come in here, and this actually does bring up a point that you can see when I accidentally go over her hair, it almost just blurs everything out. So I'm going to try and stay away from the edges and just get the ones that are further away from her head, and then come in with my stamp tool and clean up that edge so it doesn't look blurry. So that's looking pretty good. I think I can just clean that up and we can move on. Alright, that looks pretty good. This is before, that's after. I've cleaned up those hairs. These ones should be behind my text, so I'll save this as a smart object. And actually, this is bringing up a good point, something that you'll probably run into. Because I just embedded a JPEG image, even though it is a smart object, it's not something that supports layers. I have to, well, let's just read through the message. We can't save this document back to its original file format of JPEG because I have multiple layers. So I need to flatten layers and discard the extra data necessary so that it can preserve the JPEG, but that's destructive. Or I could just save as, and the smart object will not be updated. And that's not something I want to deal with. So what I'm actually going to do is just click on this layer and copy. Command-C. I'll close that and don't save. And this is a little dangerous because that layer, the work that I just did is just saved in my clipboard, but I'm just going to immediately paste it right into this document. Now, this is not the right size, obviously, because I had scaled down the image within this document, but what I want to do is make this a smart object, convert to smart object, and what this is doing is basically, because this is a layer that I created inside of Photoshop, the type of smart object that it just created is basically a Photoshop document that will support multiple layers. Now that that's set, I just need to scale it down, so I'll press Command-T and make it the same width as my document, which was 1920 pixels. Apply that, and then just line it up where it goes. And that actually snapped to the other image because my smart guides were on. Now that that's there, I will go back into my first smart object and select all, Command-A, copy. Then I'll go into my new smart object and paste. So I can keep that original just in case I ever need to go back to it. So there's my duplicate and my original. Alright, I'll save this. It will update. I can close out of it, and I can close out of the original smart object as well, and even delete the original as well. I'll rename this other layer model, and there we go. My smart object has now preserved both layers, but I can scale it up and down, move it, manipulate it however I want to within this document, and it's still going to preserve all of that work that I did. I think I can call this one good. I don't really see any other issues with it, so I'm going to move on to my last style frame. So let's take a look at my last brief I have on the desktop here, blend smoothies. So here's my brief, and this is for a smoothie company. It looks like their core values: quality ingredients, delicious variety, and healthy living. Cool. We got some colors. I've got some fonts. We're making one style frame. Let's take a look at the layout that my creative director sketched for me. Alright, so we've got our frame with, it looks like a model in the foreground. So you can see that sometimes, you know, they'll just do like a box with an X through it, but other times they'll actually do a little more detail with sketching. It really depends on your creative director and if you're getting this kind of a layout at all. But it looks like we need to have a model with smoothie and the logo on the cup. So I'm betting that the photography I'm getting is not actually from this company, so I'm probably going to have to put the logo onto the cup. And up here at the top we've got a block with some text that says a tidal wave of tasty. Okay. And then we've got all of this mess happening in here. What is this? We've got watermelon, pineapple, strawberries, and raspberries exploding outwards. Okay. On this side it says colorful splashes behind model and overlapping fruits. So I'm guessing it's splashes of liquid. And then I've got all these different pieces of fruit that are going to be flying out of it. Okay, it sounds like it's going to be a pretty complex composition. And then we've got the logo right down here in the bottom right. Okay, I think that's everything. Let's take a look at the stock photos that I have. In here, first of all, here's the logo. So we've got blend smoothies. Okay, but the stock photos that I have, I'm just going to bring them all up at once. And there's a splash. Okay, wow, so they gave me a whole lot of options of just these water splashes. I'm betting that these are not going to be just water, though. I think, if I remember right in the preview, it says colorful splashes behind the model and overlapping fruits. So they probably want it to look more like smoothies or at least fruit juices instead of water. So that'll take some manipulation, but it should be a fun challenge. We got some great nice stock photos on white backgrounds. This will be easy to extract from the backgrounds of the different fruits. Got a whole bunch of different options for the model, so that's good. And then a couple more of some fruits. So I guess first things first, we should probably pick the photo of the model that we want to use. That's probably a good place to start. So let's take a look at just those photos. Looks like it starts here, ends here. And I'll bring those all up at once. So we've got 3 of this woman. She's got a little jar with a smoothie in it. We've got 2 of this woman. Some different expressions on her face. And then 4 options of this woman. So I've got some variety. I've got some stuff to choose from. Just my initial reaction to these photos, these 3 right here, the model is turned to the side. And based on this layout, it seems like he wants a very centered composition. And with her being rotated, I would want to just naturally push her off to one side, to her or to our left, just in terms of balance of the composition. Whereas these ones, you know, these couple, they're looking off to the side, but they're at least facing straight forward. So I think I've already narrowed it down to being between these 2 models. And not necessarily this one. Plus, she's using kind of like a clear plastic jar here, which would be a little bit more difficult to put the logo on. I don't think it would make as much sense. I don't think that this smoothie company is giving away nice plastic, like mason jar style mugs with their smoothies, so they're probably going to want to see something more like this cup here. That even just looks like a soda cup, but we can probably get away with that. This one doesn't really look any different. So I think I've narrowed it down to those 2 models, and now it's just a matter of picking which one. I don't know which would work better. Each one has some interesting challenges. I don't think I'm going to be able to use this pink background. According to their branding, I think, yeah, they've got more blues. So I'm probably going to have to extract them from the background. And they both have kind of some fine hair details that I'll have to deal with. But why don't we start with this one right here? Because I think the whole concept of this piece, if the visuals are these fruits and things exploding out from behind her, and we've got this text of a tidal wave of tasty, it seems like they want kind of like a surprised expression just based on like these three photos right here. I think that might fit the vibe of the piece a little bit better. So I'm thinking it's going to be between this photo here and this photo here. So why don't we try these two? I'll just cut them both out really quickly and go from there. So let me get these two in there. I'm going to first close this sniffling ad out and make a new document. File new and web preset. Click create. Alright, I want my artboard to be transparent, so I'll select that artboard, change the background to transparent, and then bring my photo in here. So I'll go into File, Place Embedded, and I will navigate to that folder. So Blend Smoothie Stock, and then I think it was right in here, that one. We'll start with this, click on Place, and this time, because I am going to be manipulating these pixels, instead of just applying it, I'm going to first scale it up to 100%, which, by the way, you can see that these are, the width and height are in two different units. We've got pixels and percentage. If you just right-click, you can change what units you're working in. I want to scale this up to 100%, so I'll just type that in with this link, constrain the width and the height together checked. And that way it's 100%. Then I'll apply it. And then what I need to do is convert this to a smart object again. So if I right click on it and say convert to smart object now this is a Photoshop smart object. Remember before I wasn't able to make changes to the smart object because it was just a JPEG, a flat image smart object, and I had to do that crazy workaround copying and pasting the layers into new smart objects. But now if I double click on this, I can go in, I can make any adjustments to this as I want because the extension is PSB, which I don't know exactly what that stands for, but it's Photoshop related. It's not a JPEG, JPG, it's PSB, which means it will support anything that you do in Photoshop when I go to save it. Alright, now that I have this open, I can go ahead and start cutting her out. Now, for the most part, it's not going to be a difficult selection, but her hair is very frizzy and kind of fine. There's a lot of details and gaps in here. This is a perfect candidate for the select and mask feature. So I pressed W to get to my quick selection tool. If you go to any of the selection tools, select and mask will show up here. So I'm going to just click on select and mask with that layer selected, and then make sure that my view mode is set to, I don't know, let's say overlay. Now, it's all red because nothing is selected, but I'm going to switch to my quick selection tool and start brushing in what I want selected. Now, my brush is incredibly small, so I'm going to just scale that up until it's something like that, and then I'll just start painting on top of her. So I'll just go right down the middle, and it's just going to very quickly and intelligently grab what it thinks that I want selected. Now, my background is pink, so this red overlay isn't the greatest choice, so I'm going to change that to being, I don't know, something a little bit different. Actually, this is hard because her shirt is plaid, so pretty much any color I pick, something from her shirt is going to blend in with it. So instead of the color, maybe I actually just want to change it to being on top of black. And then just turn the opacity down a little bit so I can still see the parts that I'm not selecting. There we go. So that's a little easier to see now. I'll get all of these dark areas that it's missing in my selection. And this is a much, much faster process than if I were to be doing this by hand using the pen tool or any of the other selection tools, I guarantee you. Let's take a look at that on white. All right, switch back. F is going down in this list. Shift F goes back up the list. So I'm going to press F to get to white and black, just switching between those. Looks like part of her, whoops, let me zoom in, switch to my zoom by pressing Z, and then W to get to my quick selection again. It looks like parts of her arm on this side are not being selected. It's probably because the background is pink and parts of her plaid shirt are also pink. So this actually might be something where I grab this tool right here, which is my brush tool, and this allows me to just brush in just like I would be on any other layer-based mask. Now that's a pretty hard brush. It's 100% hard. I'm going to turn the softness down to about 50, just so it's not such a harsh edge, and fix these edges in here a little bit. We can see some of these particles on the outside. I just hold down Option or Alt to subtract from my selection, and that way I can paint in like this, or just let go of the keyboard and paint back on with this brush tool. So I'm just taking care of all these little edges, making sure that everything is in there. The quick selection tool is great, but obviously it is going to struggle when you got pink fabric right up against the pink background. So you can't rely on it being perfect 100% of the time. Alright, I think I need to switch my mode to being the marching ants. That's much easier for me to see what I'm actually selecting. You should be very aware of all those different view modes just so that it's clear what you're selecting and what's not selected. I'm going to switch to my quick selection tool, make it much smaller, and hold down Option to subtract from my selection here. And even that's having trouble because of the similarities in those pinks. So I'm going to again switch to my brush and just turn it way down. Actually, this might even be a good option for the lasso tool because I can get right up into that point. I'm holding down Option again to subtract from that selection. And there we go. Now I've got a cleaner selection right up there into that little corner. Look at this. This is funny. This is, I think, part of the tag that belongs to this shirt. So what happened is probably this photographer bought some wardrobe for these models and didn't take off the tag so that they can return it after the fact. That's just a funny little thing. That's pretty funny. I like that. Obviously, I don't need to make sure that's in my selection. Nobody's ever going to see that. But I'll just continue my way around here, making sure everything is selected that should be, and taking out things that shouldn't be. So get rid of this section right here. I'm just going to work my way around the entire image. And by the way, I'm holding down spacebar anytime I want to pan around. Remember, that's the quick shortcut for being able to switch to the hand tool. Just holding down spacebar temporarily switches to that tool. Okay, I think I've worked my way all the way around it, and now what I really need to focus on is the hair. So let me switch to a different view, maybe the over black, and you can see that that's really going to have some issues, especially if I want to put this on top of a blue background. In fact, let me just switch to my overlay, make this 100%, and then change the color to being blue, something like what we found in the style guide, brand identity right here. That's a bright blue. So obviously we wouldn't see that pink behind the hair, so I need to make some very fine adjustments, masking selections on that hair, and really that would be almost impossible to do by hand because look at all these fine little details of the hair. It's just not going to happen. Well, there's an incredibly powerful tool right here in Select and Mask that's made for doing exactly this type of selection, and it's this tool right here called the Refine Edge Brush Tool. So I'm going to click on that, and what this does is it gives you a brush just like the brush tool does or the quick selection, but what you can do with it now is just kind of click and paint over edges specifically for things like hair that have these really fine details, and watch what happens. Let's click and brush and then let go. It'll take a second, and then it's made some really fine-tuned selections around that hair. Now, it doesn't look perfect, but it looks way better than if I were to be doing this by hand. Let me turn my opacity of this overlay down a little bit so we can see that there are actually some hairs over here that I didn't get in my selection. If I just brush over these, it actually can add it to the mask. So I'm just going to do that for all of this hair right here that I missed. But I'm also going to paint over these sections right here where there's pink. You see how it's kind of removing all of that pink. It's able to distinguish all of these incredibly fine little details of the hair from the background. That's exactly what this tool was designed for, and it does a fantastic job at just that. So I'm just going to work my way around this hair a little bit at a time, painting around these edges, bringing in these stray hairs, and painting out the pink that's showing up behind sections of the hair. Now the parts that are going really deep into the hair might not be an issue on that blue background, but that's something we can address later on if we need to. So I'm just going to continue around her hair, going around these fine little details and seeing how it does. It's best to do small sections at a time, not giant brush strokes. If I were to turn this way up and go over like this, then it might accidentally see right here, it took out part of her eyebrow. Don't want to do that, so let me undo, Command Z. Keep your brush relatively small and just paint over little sections at a time. And this could take a little bit of time depending on the resolution of your photo and how complex the actual selection is, and even how you have things like the edge detection set up over here. Right now I haven't even touched any of these controls, so it is going pretty quickly for me. Now I know in the last style frame I was really trying to remove all of these stray hairs, but just to show you how powerful this tool is, I'm going to try and include them so we can get a really good idea of how tiny of little details this brush can really pick up on. There we go, punch out some of those holes in there. And another thing to be aware of is that if you were to do something like this and remove her eye accidentally, you can also subtract using this brush tool. Just again holding Option or Alt, and that's the erase refinement. So you just brush over the part that shouldn't have gotten that refinement, and it puts it right back where it was. Alright, so I think I've covered all of the hair. Let's take a look at the actual mask view. So that's black and white right here. Now look at that mask. Look at how fine, like the tiny little details that it was able to pick up on. Now I'm noticing a little issue right here. You can tell that something is being selected that doesn't need to be. So let me grab that refinement tool again and just paint over this one more time. And even get in real nice and close. It's really dropping the quality as I do that brushing, but I think if I maybe just switch back to my overlay, this will be easier, and I can subtract some of this maybe. There we go. That's looking a little bit better. Alright, now it's taking out part of her shoulder here, so I'm going to hold Option and subtract that selection. But that's looking really great. Let's go back to that mask view. I think that's a really solid selection. There's just a little bit that I need to clean up down here, I'm noticing, so I'm going to grab my brush tool, paint this in. And there's some stuff over here that also, yep. So it's always great to be switching between views to get a different perspective on the selection that you've made. Let me just fix all these little issues. And this is really probably just a result of the quick selection tool not being able to distinguish between the fabric of her shirt and the background well enough. Something like that looks pretty good. Again, you're going to be looking at this at a much smaller scale, so you're probably never going to see those little details, but the cleaner selection you make, the better it's going to look. So there she is, cut out from the background, and I can just swap through these one more time. Again, looking at it on a black background, on a white background, that looks really great. But we can take this even one step further with some of these options over here. If we look really close, and I'll switch to my overlay view, there, so we can see it on this blue background again. You can see that there's still some blue tint or some pink tint coming through these gaps of her hair. And some of this hair does look a little bit chunky. It looks a little harsh. So we can do some things like feather the selection just a little bit. If I turn it up too much, again, that's going to make it look all glowy. But I could feather it just a little bit, maybe 1 or maybe 2 pixels. And that really helps soften everything. I think 2 is a little too much, so let's just do it around 1. I can also increase the smoothness of my selection a little bit, and that could help repair some of that chunkiness from my selection. But what's really, really great about the features over here is these output settings. I can choose decontaminate colors. So take a look at maybe this part right here. We see some of that pink showing through. I click on decontaminate colors, and it's basically removed that. Now this is set to 100%, so it's also blurred a lot of this. My selection doesn't look that great anymore, but if I turn this down, to say 50 and let it update. There we go. And that might even be more than it needs. 25, 26%. That looks much better. I'll turn this off. And you see that pink tint come back. And I turn it back on, and it removes that. So what this is doing is manipulating the colors of the actual layer. So it's not going to allow me to just export it as a mask on top of that layer, because it's changing the layer, and it doesn't want me to lose my original. So my only options are things to do with making a new layer or a new document. So I'm going to have new layer with layer mask selected. So it'll duplicate that original layer, apply the mask, and decontaminate those colors. But I think that is just a fantastic use of that tool. I think it worked out great. I'll click OK, and there we go. I've got my new layer, backup original just in case, but that's a really, really great selection. So I'll save that smart object. It'll take a little bit because that is a lot of information to save in that document. This is a very high resolution image. But here we go, back in my main document. It's all set up, ready to go, and I can scale it down. I'll turn it to maybe 20% scale. And there we go. That's a great selection. Now I'm going to save this document next so that I don't lose any of my work. Put it under Blend Smoothies. Style Frame 01. Okay, click Save. Okay. Now that's all saved. My progress will not be lost. And I'll just drop her down to the bottom of the frame. It looks like, according to this guide, yeah, it actually looks like it might even take up less of the frame. But I can play around with that more once I add in more elements. Now, that is one of the two options. Why don't I just quickly cut out the second model that I wanted to use as well, which was this one right here. I'll just come to File, Place Embedded, grab that photo, there we go, and hit place. Once again, I'm going to scale this up to 100%, making sure the width and height are linked. Apply that, convert it to a smart object, go in there and make my quick mask selection. So select and mask, and I'll start painting this out again. This one might be a little bit easier because her hair isn't quite as curly. It's a lot smoother. So I'll just grab as much as I can, and her shirt is solid. The sweater that she's wearing is solid, so the edge detection is probably going to be a lot more straightforward with my quick selection tool. Just want to make sure that everything is nice and contained in here. So let's look at our marching ants view, and doesn't look like I'm missing anything major. Maybe a little bit right in here. That looks pretty good. A little bit right there was missing. Okay, I think that's going to work. And now I'll just refine the hair strands a little bit with this Refine Edge tool. So let me make that brush a little bit bigger and switch my view to the overlay, and then just paint some of this out. See how much of that I can dig into that's further into her hair. Make my brush just a little bit bigger and then do kind of a broad stroke. This isn't as difficult of hair to cut out, I don't think, so I think I can get away with bigger, broader strokes. And I'm not too worried about all of these little hairs that are flying off the top of her head. Just the main portions of her hair. Alright, I think that did a pretty good job. Let's switch through some of these other views. I definitely could use some softening here, so let me smooth it up just a tiny bit, feather it out a little, maybe not quite as much. That looks pretty good. Take a look at the mask mode. I think that's doing a really decent job. And yeah, I think actually that's going to work just fine. I'll just make sure to decontaminate those colors. And there we go. A lot of that pink is taken away. Again, the amount is way too high. So let me turn that down and maybe bump it up just a little more than that. There we go. That looks pretty good. I think if I change this to that blue overlay, you can get a preview of what that'll look like. And that's not bad. I think if it becomes an issue, I can always color this hair so that instead of being tinted pink, it's tinted blue. But there we go. I think that selection's great. New layer with layer mask. Click OK. I've cut that out very quickly. Save that, close it, and there we go. We have it cut out in our main document. I'll scale this down to, again, about 20% and move her down in the frame. Alright, so I've got these two different options. And I think that I'm actually liking the second option better. They're both wearing glasses, but these ones are tinted. They look like sunglasses. It's harder to see your eyes. They both have very similar expressions, but I think this one looks a little bit more almost scared, kind of like she's watching a thriller or some kind of intense movie, an action movie in a theater. For whatever reason, that's the vibe I'm getting. Whereas this one, it looks like she's actually surprised by the taste of the drink she's drinking, which is what I want. I want this ad to have that feeling of this is like a surprisingly good flavor of all of this, the fruit that's exploding around behind her. I don't want it to be something that makes it look like she's afraid. So I'm just going to put this one, I'll put them both into a group, call it model, and then I'll just hide the original just in case I ever change my mind. But I think this is the photo I'm going to go with. Now, I want to make sure that this is perfectly centered in my document, and there are some align tools in Photoshop just like in Illustrator, so I can just have that selected and then align it to the center of the document, to the edges, just like anything else. Let me drop that down to the bottom, and I think that's going to be good. Next, I want to make the background, so I think we're going to go with a bright blue color. That's the first color in their brand identity, so let's bring that color into this document. Just bringing that PDF right inside. That way you can sample the colors. And I'm going to just switch my eyedropper tool, eye on the keyboard, click on that blue, and then I'm going to make a new solid color. So down here with my layers menu, I'm going to choose solid color. It's already picked that blue because that's what I had sampled with my eyedropper. Click OK, drag that down to the bottom, and then I'll go ahead and group that and call it the BG for background. And for whatever reason that bumped it up to the top of the layers. I'm just going to send it back down to the back. Alright, so I've got two more colors. I'll probably be using those, but I'm just going to turn that off for now. Obviously, this solid blue background is not that great to look at. I want to add a little bit more depth to it. So let's go ahead and use one of our techniques of adjustment layers and a curves layer to give kind of like a bright spot right behind her. So maybe right about there in terms of brightness, and then I'll use a vector mask to make that brighter. Just draw that path out. Actually, that's a shape. Something I'm constantly doing is drawing a shape when I want a path and drawing a path when I actually want a shape. But there we go. Corrected. Add that mask, and I can delete the layer mask. So I'm left with that. Now I just need to feather it out quite a bit, and then maybe scale it up. Yeah, I'm definitely going to want it bigger so I can feather it out a lot more, and then make it even brighter, I think. And this might be one of these examples where using an actual curves adjustment might not be the best bet. Instead, I think what I want to do is just duplicate this color fill and then make the color fill brighter, maybe even a little bit more green. Let's bring it right around that area and click OK, and then bring this layer mask onto that layer. Then I can get rid of my curves. And now, instead of just brightening it using an adjustment layer, I can actually choose a different color that I want it to blend from. So, I mean, I could do something like yellow or green, but I'll stick to something pretty similar to what the original was, this blue color. And then maybe just turn the feathering down a little bit. So let's get into our feathering. Turn that down to somewhere around there. It's not bad. Maybe that's not quite enough, but this is something that, because it is a live vector shape, I can adjust that as much as I want. Just center that right behind her head. I think that looks pretty good. And that's a good start, at least for the background. Make sure to save all the time. I'm going to save that progress. And we need to bring in some of the other elements. There's going to be a lot of them. There's, all the different fruit slices as well as all the splashes. So why don't we just start cutting out some fruit? I'm going to grab one of these photos, go to File, Open, and find let's say the strawberries and the raspberries. I think that's somewhere in here. So there's a shot of some raspberries, but there was this one particular shot right here where we have both strawberries and raspberries in the same photo. And that's great for me because then I'll know that in relationship to each other, the scale is correct with the strawberries and raspberries. I can obviously do that by eye, but this is just going to be easier for me. So I'll open up this image. And I think this has plenty of whole strawberries and raspberries for me to deal with. Obviously the ones on the edges are cut off, so I can't use those. But I'll just stick to the ones that are on the inside that are whole, and let's think about how I might go about doing this, because I need to make all of these into individual layers, and I'm going to have to be making a lot of selections. So I think what would actually make more sense is if I selected the white and then inverted my selection. Instead of trying to make a selection of the red and the green and then, getting each one of these individually selected, it might be quicker if I just select the entire background. So let's just start with, I don't know, the Magic Wand tool, which is under this tool right here, Quick Selection. So Magic Wand, my tolerance is pretty high. Maybe I'll drop that down to 30. And then I'll make sure that Contiguous is turned on, because if that's not, and I select, that's going to select anything that is that color in this image. But Contiguous is going to keep that selection into wherever I had clicked. So anything that is touching the color that I selected that's similar, it will select. But it won't go beyond into these strawberries because the red is acting as kind of like a barrier. That's what I want. So now that I have a pretty good selection, I'm going to hold down Shift and just continue to add to my selection. And this is a little bit tedious of a process, but it's actually working out fairly well. So if I just make sure that the majority of the white is selected on the pieces that matter, like these ones that are cut off don't matter, so I'm not going to bother making the selection closer on those. But as long as I can get these close enough on the fruits that I need, I think the Magic Wand's going to work out just fine for this one. So let me get in here and really just make some precise adjustments to my selection, getting those gaps, making sure there's nothing selected or deselected that shouldn't be. That looks pretty good. I can always clean these up a little bit more in a bit. Something like that. I think that one is going to need the lasso tool to get into my selection. There we go. And then let's take a look at this one. That looks pretty good. There we go. All right. So I hope that what you're getting out of this is that there's different approaches you can take to any given selection. Sometimes the Magic Wand is going to work out great. Sometimes the Quick Selection is going to work better. Sometimes you want to jump into Quick Select for the hair adjustments, or not Quick Select, but Select and Mask for the hair adjustments. But regardless, I think I'm going to go into Select and Mask now that I have everything selected, and then refine my selection even better, because these global refinements of smoothing and feathering are very, very nice to have and easy to adjust and fiddle with until you have a selection that's working really well. So I'm going to change this from the overlay to, let's say, the marching ants. And I need to invert my selection, which there is a button for right here. Right now, remember, I have the actual background selected. Everything else is deselected. But if I click on Invert, then I have just the strawberries and the raspberries selected. All right, so let me just zoom in here, looking at the ones that actually matter. And I think I can clean this up a little bit just by smoothing my selection a tad. Remember, if I turn this up too far, it's not going to end up looking that great. But if I leave it down around 25, that's probably going to produce a pretty good result. And then maybe I'll just feather it out by like a half a pixel. Not even a whole pixel, just something to smooth off the edge a little tiny bit. And that looks pretty dang great. I think I'm happy with that. I'll click on Output to, instead of just a selection, I'm going to say Layer Mask, so it automatically adds that layer mask for me. I don't need to decontaminate any of the colors or anything like that. Everything else looks great. Click OK, and there we go. Got my mask, and I can start painting out the ones that I don't need. So I'm just going to grab the lasso tool and make a selection, and then delete, actually Command Delete, to fill that in with my background color of black. And I'll do that for any of the fruit that's going off the edge of the frame. So that's this guy here, these strawberries here, these ones down here, this one for sure, these two, and I think that's everything. Now let me zoom in real close here. It looks like, yep, I definitely missed that. So let me just jump right back into my select and mask, and then use my quick select and subtract that out. That looks like it did a little too much damage, so let me just actually use the magic wand. I'll grab that and then just make a selection around there and make that a little bit closer to the raspberry. There we go, and then I'll just fill that Command D with the background. That looks great. I think that's going to work. Okay, so now that I have them all cut out, I need to separate them out into their own layers, because if I were to try to move this around, it's still going to move as a whole. Now, this is a case where that was an easy enough selection. It was not that much work, and I'm not really going to need to manipulate these like I might a picture of a person, that I think I'm okay with just applying this mask and making all of the hidden information just go away completely. So I'm going to right click on this layer and say Apply Layer Mask. Now it's all one layer with transparency, no background information there at all, no mask. And from here, I can now separate all these different shapes out into their own layers. So this is kind of a repetitive process, but I'm just going to use, I think, the rectangular marquee tool, and I'll get all the raspberries first, and then I'll do the strawberries. So I'm going to just drag a selection around this raspberry, press Command X to cut, and then paste. And that pastes right in the center. Then I'll make sure to select my other layer, the one with the fruit on it, select the next raspberry, Command X, paste. And I can temporarily switch to my move tool by holding down Command. Then I can just click anywhere on that main layer to reselect it. And that is because I have auto select layer on. Remember that. Alright, so let's continue on. I'm going to get this raspberry here, cut, paste. Just moving pretty quickly now. Cut, paste, cut, paste. And because this last layer is on its own, it shouldn't have anything else, but there is clearly something else within this selection, and I can tell because of the bounding box. So even the slightest, tiniest pixel, stray pixel, can add to your selection. So I'm just going to select a box real close around the strawberry here. Then I'm going to invert my selection, which is Command-Shift-I. Now it's selected everything but that strawberry, and hit delete. Now I'll deselect, Command D. And now that bounding box is only around the strawberry, and I can be sure there are no stray pixels. I'll just line that up to the center of my document. If for whatever reason you can't click on these alignment tools, I think it either has something to do with smart objects or potentially documents that actually have artboards. But all you have to do is make a selection of the canvas by pressing Command A to select all. And then, with that layer selected, I can align it to the center of my selection. So whatever your selection is, the alignment tools will work with that selection. Alright, I'll deselect, Command D. Now all of these layers are separated out into their own individual fruit layers, and I need to label them. So at the bottom is, these were pasted in descending order, so I'm going to start with strawberries. So strawberry, and then just one. Now I could retype strawberry and type 2 and do that over and over again, but instead I'm just going to speed this up a little bit by copying the part of the name that I want to preserve. So everything including the space just before the number. I'll copy that and then paste, and now all I have to do is press 3. And then I'll do the fourth strawberry, paste 4. Alright, so that should be all 4 of my strawberries, and the rest are raspberries. So now I'll type in raspberry 1 and copy, raspberry, copy everything but the 1, Command C, and then paste 2, paste 3. This makes it much quicker to do a very tedious task. Now, I realize this is tedious, but it is very important to stay organized, because I can already tell this document in particular is going to have a lot of layers. So I need to be able to identify what layer is what very quickly and easily, even without being able to really see what the thumbnail is, because obviously these are very tiny, so it's not that easy to see. I'm actually going to go one more step beyond just labeling these by renaming them, and you can actually label these layers, any layer or group, with a color. So I'm going to right-click on all the strawberries, or select all the strawberries, right-click, and say red. Now I'm going to get that red highlight showing up on all those layers, and it's going to be very easy for me to identify those as strawberries now. Then I'll grab all of the raspberries and maybe make them orange. They don't have to directly correlate to the fruit, but there we go. Now I have all my raspberries, all my strawberries ready to go. Now that they're all cut out, I'm going to select all of the layers by clicking on the first one, shift-clicking on the last one, and saying copy, Command C, then going back to my style frame document and paste, Command V, and they're all contained in this document now. I'm just going to group them together and call them fruit. Fruit, there we go. And all of my labels are preserved in there. So there we go. We've got all this fruit. One last thing I need to do is make them all smart objects, because if I were to scale these down at this point, they would not preserve the details if I ever tried to scale them up again. So this is again going to be kind of a tedious task, but there's another way to speed this up. Instead of saying right-click, convert to smart object for every single one of these, I can just right-click and then type CON, and it's going to jump to that menu item. So if you ever need to get to a very specific menu item, like say merge down, just type in MER, and then it'll jump to that, whatever it comes to first. So I needed to type out CON before I got to convert to smart object. I'm just going to do that for each one of these. Whoa, that was a mistake. Undo. There we go. And it's actually removing my color labels, so I'm going to have to redo that. It's probably just transferring them into the smart objects. And honestly, I don't know if this is faster than right-clicking and just saying convert to smart object, but it's worth knowing to be able to just jump to any specific menu item very quickly. So there we go. I'm going to relabel these red and relabel these orange, and I can move on. Now I still have to do pineapple and watermelon, but the process is going to be exactly the same, so I'm kind of just going to jump through this very quickly for you. Okay, so I've got all of my fruit in this document now. They're all colored, they're labeled, they're all smart objects, so I can go ahead and scale this down. And that's what I want to do because it's obviously way too big. Scale everything down to about the size I think it'll need to be. And then I kind of need to decide how big each object should be in relationship to each other. So you kind of got to think about how big a watermelon is versus how big the pineapple slices would be. I think the pineapple slices should be a little bit bigger than that. Probably something like there. And I guess, you know, watermelons can be different sizes, so it is a little bit just up to me to decide how I want it to look. But these are actually looking, I think, fairly decent. Maybe the watermelon could scale up just a little bit in relationship to the raspberries and the strawberries. Let's move these out of the way so we can see them all together. But yeah, I think, you know, we've got some variety in the size of the strawberry. The pineapple slices maybe could be just a little bit bigger, but I'm not going to be too crazy nitpicky with this. I think relatively all of these are a good size in relationship to each other. And I think that as far as the color goes, the red strawberries, raspberries, and watermelons all look pretty great. I think the color works, but for whatever reason, these pineapples look really, really pale and desaturated and kind of sad to me. And I just want to brighten them up a little bit, give them a little bit more saturation so that they match the saturation of these other bright, vibrant colors. So I'm going to do this probably using an adjustment called hue and saturation, but I don't want to use an adjustment layer because, remember, that's going to affect anything below it, and if I apply it as a clipping mask, then it's going to be attached as a separate layer. So what I want to do is just apply the adjustment directly by going up to Image, Adjustments, and then Hue and Saturation. Now, what this allows you to do is mess with the color of whatever you're applying it to. So I'm applying it to the pineapple. If we take a look at the hue, I can make this pineapple slice green or red or pink. I could do whatever I want just by shifting the hue around on this spectrum. I can also, if I reset this, hold down Option and click on this button right here, I can decrease the saturation to make it black and white. Or I can go the opposite direction and punch it up a little bit to make it more saturated. Now, this might be a little too intense. You see that we're losing some of the details in there as I increase that saturation. But if I brought the lightness down a little bit, not too much, I don't want to darken it like this, but if I bring the lightness down just a tad, then I can have a little bit more leeway with how much saturation I can add in. So let's see, this was before and this is after. So it's really just boosted the saturation of that pineapple, and I think it makes it look a little bit more appetizing. So I think I'm good with that adjustment. I'll click OK. That'll be applied as a smart filter, and then I can apply that same adjustment to all my other layers. So if I highlight over that adjustment right there and hold down Option or Alt and a BC, click and drag, I can very quickly apply this to all of my other layers. So just go down the line. I'm seeing this little icon over here letting me know that these are being applied, and now all of my pineapple slices have that same adjustment. So there we go. We've got much more appetizing looking pineapple, and now I think it's time to start arranging these and keeping aware what other elements need to be on screen. So I've got this text up here that says a tidal weight of tasty. Why don't I get that in there just so I know how much room I need overhead? So I'm just going to bring some of these elements down. So there's my text layer, got my model, my fruit, and the background. Okay, now we need to put in the logo, so let me grab that, File, Place Embedded. And there's the Blend Smoothies logo. Place that in here. And this can be much smaller, I believe. It's going to go down in the bottom right corner. Yeah, so probably make that smaller. Put it somewhere around here, press enter, and this came in as black, but I'm going to need to change that color. I don't think that black is going to work on the blue background very well. I mean, it looks fine, you can read it, but I don't think that's going to go with their brand. So maybe I'll just pull that color scheme up again, and we'll try this light blue, this pale blue. Now, I can't just change the color of this by filling it with the color I want, because it's a smart object and it's not an actual like vector path. It is a vector Illustrator file, but I'm not editing it as if it was a vector path. But a really quick way to be able to change the color of a layer, any layer, is by using a layer style. So if I double click on this layer to open up the layer styles, we have right here, color overlay. That's the one that I want. That's just going to change the color to whatever I pick. So I can make it this nice bright yellow color, or if I come over with the color picker open, I can sample either of these colors. So I don't think I want to use that same color. Since I have 3 color options, I'm going to use the blue one that's still pretty white, but that way it just blends in the background a little bit more, but you can still totally see it. Okay, click OK, close that up so it's not taking up too much room, and then just kind of position this in the bottom right corner. I think that's working out. Alright, so now I can turn my fruit back on and we can start arranging this. Now, based on this guide, there was no real layout that I can follow. Obviously these little triangles are probably representing the watermelon, and then the strawberries and the raspberries, but it's pretty much going to be up to me as to how I arrange these elements on the screen. So I'm just going to start positioning them where I think they could go, and I think all of them should be pointing inwards. That is something I can pull from this, is that it looks like the shapes are all pointed towards the model, and that can be used as kind of like a design element to help you draw your eye inwards to the center of the frame where the subject is. So maybe I'll just position these a little bit so that they're kind of just going in different directions, all pointing in towards the model. And then I'm going to need to obviously introduce some of these pineapple slices. I may not use every single one of them. This might be too much cramming into to a small space, and I might have to scale everything down a little bit. I don't know. I'm just randomly pretty much placing these together, kind of like a puzzle. So I'm just going to see how these fit together, how I can get them to interact with each other, and kind of support the overall advertisement. Alright, so I've got a pretty decent layout here, just kind of randomly placed. There wasn't much rhyme or reason to it. I was just kind of trying to offset all these different fruits in different ways and make them, feel like they go together and are kind of exploding out. I don't think I'm going to end up using these ones over here. Maybe one more pineapple slice. Stick on the outside of this watermelon, but these two layers right here, I don't know that I need them. So I'm just going to hide them for now. Turn these two layers off. And somehow I accidentally moved these out of the fruit layer. So let me drag them there and just put the ones that I turned off up at the top. Alright, so now all that fruit is contained in that group. It's kind of laid out. The other element that I'm missing, though, is the splashes. So I need to start working on that. So let's just take a look at one of them. I'll just open it up here in Photoshop. And let's say, sure, that one. That one looks fun. Now, this was shot on top of a white background, so I can actually use a blending mode to composite this into the rest of my document, making it look like the background's actually gone. Let me show you how that works. I'm just going to select all, copy, and then go to my main document and paste. So that's pasted the contents of the other image in as a layer, and I'll just convert this to a smart object, and then scale it down so that it fits the size of my document a little bit better. So I can put it right over here and apply that. And there's a blend mode under here. These are your blend modes, remember, called multiply right there. Now what multiply is going to do is remove basically all of the bright pixels, everything white, and it's going to blend everything that's not 100% white. So watch what happens. I click on that, and there we go. We've got this water splash that is now basically removed from the background, no masking necessary. And that's great. So I can move that splash down behind the model, and now it looks like I've got that splash interacting with these other fruit layers. The problem is I don't want it to look like water. I need to color it. So what's one way that I could do that? Well, hue and saturation. So let's just bring that up, image mode, or image adjust, hue and saturation, and see what we can do. Now I can make this a lot more saturated for one, so now that's a much more vibrant blue, and I could shift the color around so there it's a little bit more green, but watch what happens as I get to like the red area. Even though my saturation is all the way up, it's super dark. It's a very kind of ugly red, and if I try to lighten it up, I lose a lot of that saturation. Now this is something that is just a result of the blending mode multiply. For some of these colors, it might work out just fine if I wanted a green layer like that. That might be fine, but if I wanted a brighter, like more neon version of that green, it's going to be really tough. And this is just, again, a limitation of using multiply. I could also try using colorize, which is basically going to get rid of all of the color information and just try and make something a little bit more uniform, but I'm still running into the same issue. So instead of doing that, I'm going to hit cancel, and I think I'm actually going to have to not use the multiply blend mode. So I'm going to turn that off back down to normal, and instead I'm going to mask this out. But I'm not going to do it in here. I want to do it inside the smart object. So I'm going to double click into that, and I'm going to use a different selection technique for making a selection of the white, because I don't want this time to just select the outside of this layer and then invert it and select that, because there's still going to be a lot of white inside of this splash that I don't want. And I could use the whole non-contiguous selection to try and counteract that, but it's not very flexible. What is flexible, however, is a selection tool. If I come up to select, down to color range, I'm able to, with the eyedropper, pick a specific color and then choose what it calls fuzziness, but this is basically a tolerance for how much is being selected. And my preview is kind of giving me a weird overlay here. I could set it to none, and then I just see the image, and then my little preview is right here. But you can see as I click and drag this around, as soon as I hit the white, then we see that come in. And I can adjust this slider to make it more or less of what should be semi-transparent. And we can change our selection preview as well. If I go to, say, like a quick mask, then we can see that overlay. The red is what's not selected, remember that. So what I actually want to do is click this checkbox that says invert. And now the white is being deselected and the splash is what's remaining. So if I turn the fuzziness way down, you see it's very harsh, very sensitive. It's only picking those perfectly white pixels. But if I turn the fuzziness up just a little bit, then we're getting some of this semi-transparency showing through. So I think somewhere around there is what I want to start with. I can always redo this if I need to, but I think that's going to work. I'll click OK, and it loads it as a selection. And from there, I can just add a layer mask. So now that I have my transparency, I'll save this smart object, close out of it, and I can close out of this original water splash as well. But there we go. We've got a very similar effect. It doesn't look quite as good as if it was on multiply. So you can see that blends everything together a little bit nicer. But from here, I can modify the colors without worrying about how it's blending into the other objects. So I'm going to, again, go up to Image Mode, or sorry, Adjustments. I always default to going to Mode. Image Adjustments, Hue and Saturation, and then just turn up that saturation quite a bit, and then shift this over to, I don't know, something bright blue. Or maybe blue's not right. Maybe I should go with like a yellow, because we've got the pineapple juice, right? So I want to find a nice golden color, something like that, to match the pineapple. And then maybe turn up the lightness so those dark areas aren't quite so dark. Something like that. Don't want to overdo any of these, but just finding a good balance, maybe making this a little more orange, somewhere right in there, is pretty fun. And then maybe turn the saturation down just a tad. Lightness up. There we go. That looks like liquid still. Alright, now I can hit OK, and I've now got a splash that I can resize. By the way, when you transform a smart object, all of the effects are temporarily disabled, so that's why it's going back to blue. But now I can reposition this however I want and incorporate it into my composition. So already I've got this nice colorful splash showing up in the background. It's over top of all of the fruit right now, so this is probably going to need to be my fruit slash splashes group and bring that in so that I can layer it within these other fruit slices. Now I need to label it, so I'll call it splash 1, and let's label it blue. Because, yeah, I haven't used blue yet. But then I can drop it down, you know, behind the pineapple and watermelon. But it's still over some of the other slices of pineapple. I'm probably going to have to rearrange a lot of these, but I'll get to that in a little bit. For now, let's just grab a handful of these splashes and bring them in different colors using the same technique. Okay, so now I have a bunch of splashes in here, and it's all kind of a mess. I need to decide which elements are going to go in front of other things and what color the splashes are going to be. And this is just really more of a process than anything. So I'm just going to be making decisions based on how things look as I update them. And I'm going to move these layers around really quickly using the keyboard shortcut, which is Command left bracket or right bracket to go down or up. So I'm just going to back these down a few layers at a time until they're kind of interweaving into these other splash layers. So this one is getting a little too hidden by the other splashes, so I'm going to bring it up a little bit. Maybe it's just behind that one initial splash on the front there. This watermelon, I basically don't want any of these big elements to be above everything, but I also don't want it to be completely buried behind every splash. So maybe right around there. But I don't really like this green one over top of that watermelon. So I'll make sure that's the right layer. Yep, I have that one selected, and I'll back that up a little bit. There we go. Now this pineapple is getting completely buried. Let me bring that up. Maybe about there. And that raspberry, I'm not too upset with that. This pineapple could probably go back behind one of the splashes. Yep. That just makes it look like it's part of this splash scene a little bit more. You'll bring this one up above the yellow. Alright. Now, one thing I'm noticing is that for whatever reason, the pineapple slices just look a little bit dimmer to me than anything else. So I'm going to add another adjustment, I think, to all of the pineapples. And now that I've spread them all out, it's a little bit harder to find, even though they are labeled. But I can narrow down my layer palette very easily using this search bar up here one more time. So let's just look for a specific color, and that color being yellow, because I labeled all my pineapples yellow. And now I'll just take a look at, say, that one. And we already have hue and saturation applied, but I'm going to apply a curves. So image, adjustment, curves, and then just bring up the brightness a little bit, and maybe increase the contrast by bringing down the mids. And actually, I think that made it worse. I think part of what's going on here is in my hue and saturation, I had set the lightness to -8, so I'm just going to reset that back to 0 and just use hue and saturation for the color, the saturation of the overall pineapple. So I'll push that up to right around where it was, 38 I think. Click OK, and then go back into my curves, and that's actually going to disable the visibility of the other adjustment as I do this, but it'll at least allow me to make some adjustments. Click OK, and then see how it's working. So this is before, this is after. I think that's working well, but I want to maybe warm up the pineapple slice a little bit more. So I'm going to go back into my hue and saturation, push this towards the red just a little bit. There we go. Now that's looking a little bit more saturated, a little more appetizing to me. I think that's good. Click OK, and just look at that compared to the other pineapples. I think that's a better looking color. So now I just need to copy those smart filters over. So what I need to do is go into all my other pineapple slices and remove all of the effects, all of the smart filters. So I'm just going to say clear smart filters. I think I can do all this at once actually. Oh, nope, you can't. So just one of those little things you got to do one at a time. Right click on the smart filters and clear. Because if I were to copy and paste these by dragging while holding Option, it would just apply them on top of what was already there. So let me just do this for each one of these really quickly. And now all my pineapples are getting that same adjustment, and they're all looking a little bit more saturated now, a little more appetizing. Alright, now I can turn off this filter so I'm back to seeing all of my layers, and collapse all of these up so they take up less room in my layers palette. Alright. Now those colors are working pretty well, and I think everything is actually layering in fairly decently. Maybe this watermelon slice could move up above that yellow splash, but everything else is looking pretty good. Actually, this one's not behind anything, and I don't like that. So let's push that back maybe quite a bit behind all of that stuff there. Yep, and then overlap this just a little bit. Just adding a little bit more depth wherever I can. And actually, let's pull this pineapple slice up a little bit. So, you know, this is just a process. You push and pull things around, rearrange until you're happy with the way they look. But when you're dealing with so many different layers, obviously this can be a little bit of a labor-intensive process. But I think I'm happy with the way that that's shaping up. So let me close this group down and take a look at this as a whole and try and decide what else needs to be done. For one, there is one step that I need to change, which is putting the smoothie logo on the cup, and I'm assuming that this cup is not the right color. I think their brand color blue is what they're going to want to see, so I need to change the color of the cup as well. So why don't we tackle that next? I'll go into the model layer, zoom in nice and close on this cup, and I need to make a selection of that pink. Now, this might be able to be done by one of the quick selection tools, or the magic wand tool, but I think I might just want to use the pen tool and make a very precise selection. It shouldn't take too long because it's a very geometric shape. So let me grab my pen tool, P on the keyboard, I'll draw with a path and just make a selection right here. Curve out the bottom, and then I'm not going to worry about the fingers yet, but I'll go right about there. And then just modify this path a little so it fits the cup perfectly. Again, I'm not too worried about the number of paths that I use as long as it's containing the entire cup. Something like that. Alright, and then I'm going to make this a path on top of a hue and saturation adjustment layer. And then I'll make some adjustments. I want to colorize, and then I want to probably increase the saturation and shift the hue over to a blue that matches their branding fairly closely. So this is the blue that I'm trying to match with this adjustment layer. Definitely needs more saturation, and I think I'm going to have to make it a little bit darker. That's a little too purple. That hue might be good. Okay, I think that's actually pretty close. I'm not going to be, beating myself up about how perfectly that matches. I'm going to get it as close as I can, but I think that's going to work just fine. It would have been nice if I was given, kind of like a product shot of their cups, but sometimes you don't get that kind of information and you're just going to have to go with the flow. So what I need to do now is just mask out these fingers. So with my pen tool again and my vector path selected, I'm going to start drawing around the fingertips. So just make this path around that finger, and it's adding to the selection. So what I need to do is come up to this little menu right here, and instead of saying combine shapes, say subtract front shape. Alright, and then I'll do the same thing for the next finger. Looks good. Remember, you can hold spacebar to reposition a point as you're drawing these anchor points. Alright, let's take a look at that. Looks pretty good. I think I'm just going to feather that mask out just a little bit. Not a lot, maybe 1 pixel, not even a whole pixel. Let's do a half a pixel. And that way, it's just a little bit softer around her fingers, but that's a pretty good adjustment to that cup. Maybe make that just a little darker. Something like that. That matches the background pretty well. And now I need to stick the logo on that cup. So I'm going to grab this same logo that we already have and duplicate it, Command J, drag it down into this layer, and then I'm going to want to put it probably overlapping behind her fingers a little bit. So I'll scale it down to be about the size that I think it would be on the cup, and then just move it around until it's where I want it. Actually, it wouldn't really make sense to cover up any of the logo, so maybe I'll just put it right there in that nice gap. I think that's going to work out great. And because we see the bigger logo over here, it doesn't really matter how legible it is, so I'm just going to leave it as it is. I think that's going to work just fine. And with that, I think I've laid out all of my elements. Everything is composed the way it should be, and now I just need to work on making everything feel a little bit more cohesive, like it's all part of the design a little bit more. First things first, let's go ahead and tint this photo of her a little bit because it's a little warmer than I want. I want it to match the cool vibe of the entire scene. So let's add a photo filter adjustment, and that is right here. I want to make sure that this group is set to normal, not pass through, so that these adjustments are contained in that group. And then we just want to cool it off with a blue color. I'll just even sample the background. And actually, this is bringing up an interesting point. Because I had my mask selected, it is actually sampling that mask. So no matter where I click in here, it's just going to give me white. What I need to do is click off of that mask and onto the adjustment layer. Then I can go into this and sample any color in here that I want. So I'll just pick this color blue, click OK, and then play around with the density. So just cooling it up. I don't want to make her look like she's frozen, but somewhere just right in there. Cools it off just a tad. That looks good. Now she is getting a little bit lost in all this bright stuff that's happening behind her. She's kind of blending into the background, so I want to separate her from that background a little bit if I can. I think I'm going to do this through a layer style. And you know what? I just noticed I never renamed these, so let's go ahead and do that quick. Model, and this was model 2. And okay, now that that's done, I'll go into my layer styles, and the one that I want to add is called a drop shadow. So that is right down at the bottom. And this is going to do what it sounds like. It's going to add a shadow behind the layer. Let me reset that for a second. Let me zoom in here so we can see it nice and clearly, but take a look around the edges. You can see there's kind of a shadow that's being cast, and we have some different controls that allow us to choose how far away from her that shadow is, what direction the shadow is being cast, and even how blurred out that shadow is. So for this particular case, I don't really need it to be a directional shadow. I just want it to be directly behind her. So let me reset this to the default. I'll turn the distance not up but all the way down, and then just increase the size a little bit. Now that's kind of working, but it's a little bit, I I don't know, kind of just muddy, because all it's doing is using a black color, which I can control the opacity of, by the way, and multiplying that using the blend mode multiply into the background. And because it's black, there's no color information. It's just really darkening everything. Instead of black, I think I want to use this same blue color and then play around with the opacity. Now it's almost kind of like a glow. It's not brighter. There actually is an inner glow or an outer glow right there that we could use if we wanted to brighten this up. But I want it to still look kind of like a shadow. But I think I'm just going to turn up the size a little bit and maybe keep the opacity around 70. And then we can see what that looks like off and on. And that's just separating her from the background elements a little bit better. I think that's great. Now let's just do a little bit of a light wrap using our inner shadow or inner glow technique. And we'll do the same, probably brighter blue color this time. And make sure that we can see how that's working. Don't want to overdo it, but just something that adds a little bit of highlight around the edges of her is probably good. Great, okay. Now I'm going to just take a look at this as a whole. I think she's separated from the background a little bit better now. But I think I want that bright spot behind everything to be even brighter. Because of all these other elements that we put on top of it, it's really gotten lost back there. So I'm going to go into my background, select the folder, and unlock it right there. And then maybe just decrease the feathering a little bit so it's a little bit more visible there. There we go. And then maybe double click on this so I can change the color and just make it a little bit whiter. Maybe a little more blue, something like that. Okay. That looks good. Now I want to use a technique that can really bring a lot of your attention of your eyes into the center of the frame, and it's called a vignette. This is used all the time in design, and I'm going to do it using a curves adjustment. So I'm going to go to my adjustments, at the very top of my document, add a curves there, and then what I want to do is basically just darken it a little bit. Alright, and then I want to add a vector mask that is fairly large. I'm going to make it a perfect circle by holding Shift and kind of just center that up in my document. And I can actually make sure that it's perfectly aligned by using my horizontal center, vertical center. There we go. And then apply that as a mask to my curves layer. There we go. I'll delete the layer mask and then feather out quite a bit this vector mask. So probably hundreds of pixels worth. And what that's doing is just darkening the outside edges in a radial way of the entire frame. I think I could expand this path out a little bit more so it's not affecting so much of the image, just that outer edge. But what that's doing is drawing your eye inwards to the center of the frame just a little bit more. It's very subtle. You don't really notice it after it's been there for a while. And when you first see it, you definitely won't really notice it. But this is all just supporting the idea of bringing your attention to the center of the frame where the subject is and the product. I think I can make that background circle a little bit bigger now. And that way it's highlighting some more of this fruit. And maybe I'll drop it down so it's not brightening up the text too much, because then it's a little bit harder to read. But something like that I think is working fairly well. I think that I could increase this darkness even just a little bit more. And you see how that's really just saturating those outer corners. That's what I want to see. Next up, I'm starting to notice that drop shadow that we put behind her a little too much. So I think I want to turn the opacity of that down a little bit. And then I think I can stylize her photo a little bit more just by adding contrast to her, again through a curves adjustment. So image, adjust, curves. And I'm going to increase the brights and decrease the darks. Not too much, but this way it's just giving a little bit more of a contrast pop overall. I think something like that might work before and after. That just makes her pop off the background a little bit more. Maybe brighten this up just a tad. There we go. I think that looks great before and after. And then finally, just like you can apply layer styles to layers, you can also apply them to groups. So I think I want to take this fruit and splashes group and just add an overlay or an outer glow that will kind of unify everything together a little bit. So I'm going to double click on the group, go into outer glow, And you see how that just adds some dimension to those layers on the background? This is just with applying white, which I think actually is going to work fine. It's just going to brighten up everything behind those fruit slices, and I might turn the size down. Actually, no, I want that to be pretty soft. This is actually set up pretty well already, but that outer glow over everything in that group is just going to add a little bit more depth and life to those layers. I'll click OK to apply that, and then I think I want to just add one more adjustment directly in that fruit splashes group. So I'm going to come up to my adjustment layers, curves, and make sure this group is set to normal so that nothing is going from this adjustment layer outside of the group. And I just want to add a little bit of contrast to it. See, just bringing that dark down a little bit really boosts the saturation and the vibrance of that fruit. So I don't want to overdo this. I don't want to make it so that it's taking away from the subject of the frame, but just that little tiny adjustment really makes that pop, and that's what I like to see. All right, now I just want to make a couple more adjustments to that background bright spot. I want to keep it a little bit more saturated and a little bit more blue, just so that blends in a little bit better to the background. I really like having this super saturated background, but I also obviously want that to be a bright spot there. So it's a push and pull between the hue and the saturation, I think. Somewhere around there. See, before, or with that off and back on. And then I might increase the saturation on this background color just a tad, making it a little bit darker. But I think that's going to work a little bit better for me. And I just want to move this over a little bit more, just so it's not lost in the rest of the frame. We can clearly see this is 4 blend smoothies. But with that, I think I am finally done. Now, I'm just going to make sure that I rename this layer Vignette, so I know exactly what it is without having to turn it on and off. But otherwise, this should be pretty well sorted out, and I think I can send this off to my creative director to see what he thinks. Now, I realize that was a whole lot of information within this lesson for you to take in at once. We covered a lot of different advanced techniques of bringing elements together so they look like they're all part of the same composition, and applying adjustments in lots of different ways. Just remember that there are so many different ways of doing any one given thing. If you're ever lost, you can always ask a question of your TA of how to do something, or use Google, because that's a tool that you have at your disposal. There are people out there who are asking the same questions and trying to figure out the same things that you are, and you will be able to find your own answers. So start to become a little bit of a problem solver if you run into any issues or you're wondering how you might do a specific thing in Photoshop. Now I'm going to get this exported and off to my creative director.